My Lords, the virtual proceedings on the debate in the name of Lord Boswell of Aynhoe will now commence. My name is Baroness Hennig and I shall preside over the first and the last part of this debate. The debate is time limited to 3 hours. The motion for debate is the European Union Committee report on Beyond Brexit, How to Win Friends and Influence People. Lord Boswell of Aynhoe.
My Lords, it's more than a year since this report was published, since when the world has changed beyond recognition. The pandemic has compelled us to reset financial and social policies and has driven reappraisal of our nation's place among and beyond its immediate neighbours. Even before it struck, we had in some sense resolved our own national political crisis about Brexit, where, just as our committee was reporting in March last year, Britain was forced to extend the departure date, and this was followed by a change of Prime Minister, involved recasting of the withdrawal agreement, and then the election of a government with a clear majority and mandate to get Brexit done. This report, which focuses on how the UK can maximise its influence with the EU post-Brexit, is now being debated after we have formally left the EU, but while the terms of our future relationship are still to be settled. I retain in all this, I hope, some sense of proportion, yet there have been other domestic changes which set the context for this particular debate. It marks a coda personally, as I have retired from the chair of the EU committee after more than 7 years. And I am very grateful to the new chair, the Noble Earl Lord Kinnoul, if I may say, an admirable choice by this House, for his courtesy is inviting me to take the lead on this, my last bow. At the same time, I'd like to thank members of the committee across the House for their dedication to and expertise in objective scrutiny, matched by the contribution of our excellent committee staff, and of course our many diplomatic, official, academic and policy interlocutors. I'd like in particular to thank the Senior Deputy Speaker, Lord McFall, both for his careful work in reviewing our committee structures in the changed situation, and also for the contribution he made by convening the Interparliamentary Forum on Brexit, which has helped to develop mutual sympathy and understanding with the devolved legislators. Finally, I welcome the presence of the Minister and of the many noble lords who have put in to make a contribution. On rereading the report, I've been struck by the sheer complexity of the process of disengagement set out in the withdrawal instruments and summarised in our Appendix 2. Not least among these are the most sensitive issues concerning Northern Ireland, where there were significant modifications in the revised protocol agreed after our report, but where there is still no agreement on how it will be implemented, partly, of course, because of the pandemic. The report focuses on 3 main areas. First, the formal mechanisms for UK-EU engagement set out in the withdrawal agreement, notably the Joint Committee and the specialised committees that report to it. Secondly, less formal mechanisms for engagement, including the UK's potential participation in the work of EU agencies and programmes, the role of the UK mission to the EU, now known as UCMIS, and other UK offices and organisations in Brussels. Thirdly, the matter of interparliamentary engagement, which Lord Kinnoul, I think, too, will touch on. Whatever view you might take of any extension to the transition period, the pandemic, coupled with the government's oft-stated distaste for any extension, have compressed the timetable. And we now have no more than 50 days before the June summit and the deadline. There is still a need to clarify the arrangements applicable until the end of the calendar year and their relationship with those which will follow, which government have indicated will be dependent on the structure of any future relationship. To date, the public have seen remarkably little effect from our formal withdrawal, and the pandemic has left little bandwidth in government to focus on the issues. These include governance and management of the remaining period of transition, and crucially, the shape of any future relationship as it affects both trade and institutions. It would be very helpful if the Minister could today give us an appraisal of progress made in the talks, in spite of deadlines and the physical difficulties of communication. That is both in respect of trade and wider issues, with perhaps also an indication about how UCMIS is working, and so ensuring that the collective UK voice and interests are represented in Brussels. An important chapter in the report deals with the role of parliamentarians themselves. Over 50 years ago now, long before I entered Parliament, I first visited the then EEC in Brussels, being described at the time, I felt rather generously, as un expert anglais. And I have been in and out of various European institutions and settings, frequently ever since. Of course, parliamentarians rarely have any inclination to take a unified position. It's through their divergence of view and diversity of experience that they make their distinctive contribution. But we do all need to remain alert to the opportunities for influence, networking, and even simple personal friendships, which will remain open to us. My Lords, this is no time to burn bridges or haul up the drawbridge. While for now we all understand social distancing is important, conscious political self-isolation will never be a long-term goal. We must look to all aspects of our international relationships, both in Europe and wider afield. The pandemic serves to remind us that just as no man is an island, so our island nation, now rebranded as Global Britain, is built and thrives on constructive economic and political relationships. My Lords, as is typical in the immediate aftermath of a divorce, relations with the EU are at this moment, frankly, tense and difficult. They may stay this way for some time to come, but geography means that we will always be neighbours, with centuries also of complex shared history. At some stage, and in my view the sooner the better, the current tensions and disagreements will dissipate, and a new relationship will need to be forged. Both sides will need to work hard to rebuild it. The onus is on our Parliament to play its part, and I'm confident that this House, not least through the skill and dedication of its continuing EU committee, will continue to do so. In that spirit, and in consciousness that many others wish to make their contribution, I beg to move.
The question is that this motion be agreed to. Lord Fowkes of Cumnock.
My Lords, given the time limit, I'm going to deal with just one issue in the report. That's the role of the devolved nations in the transition process. It was about 2 decades ago when I was Minister of State for Scotland, and I used to meet frequently with the Scottish ministers on issues such as free personal care, the Barnett formula. We didn't always agree, of course, as Lord McConnell will no doubt confirm, but we discussed it on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis. Where are the Secretary of State for Scotland, Alistair Jack, and his deputy, Douglas Ross, now? Why are they not discussing it? Of course, the UK relationship with the EU is central, but there needs to be an acknowledgement that devolved nations are also impacted and should be involved in discussions regularly. As we've seen, the lack of involvement in the coronavirus pandemic has resulted in confusion of the messages, whether it's stay at home or stay alert, and even more important, of the practical measures being implemented in all the 4 countries. So as the UK takes the lead on UK-EU relations, will the Minister today spell out exactly how, in practical terms, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland governments will be involved? A continuation of the sort of sporadic arm's-length involvement will result in confusion, a delay and bitterness. And if the Minister agrees with me, as I think he does, that we favour continuation of our United Kingdom, we are certainly, this government and this Minister are going the wrong way about it.
Baroness Northover.
My Lords, I thank the noble Lord, Lord Boswell, for all he has done to lead the European Union Committee with such skill and dedication. But I would note that aiming to, and I quote, win friends and influence people does not seem to be the UK's strategy in its current negotiations with the EU. We hear that the government almost seems to want them to fail, with lasting damage on both sides. Leaving the EU with no deal or an inadequate deal is the next major crisis we may face. We could not stop a pandemic hitting the United Kingdom. We can stop the damage that would result from crashing out of transition on December the 31st. At the height of this pandemic, surely the government must extend the transition period. And as this report indicated so long ago now, we need to relearn how to work constructively with our neighbours, with whom we share the closest approach to global challenges. With Trump in the White House and China increasingly dominant, the EU must play a major global role. As Sir Ivan Rogers pointed out, we will need to do more than ever before to make our new relationship work. That will need engagement from the very top. We have another global crisis threatening us, climate change, and a vaccine won't take that away. The government has said that it wishes to work with the EU on issues such as this. We used to maximise our influence by leading in the EU. Now we need to ensure that we are at least involved, and that will be a difficult but essential task. This report laid out some of the ways in which we can stay informed and engaged, and I hope that it does not fall on deaf ears.
The Earl of Kinnoul.
My Lords, while there is not time for the usual courtesies, I must begin by thanking my predecessor as chair, the noble Lord Boswell of AU, for his long service to the committee and for his excellent and hugely informative opening speech, a fitting swan song. My Lords, I shall focus only on the institutional structure for the future EU relationship, and in particular, its parliamentary dimension. Our relationship with the EU, its 27 member states and 450 million citizens, is going to be complex, and a relationship of such complexity will need structure. Within that structure, the parliamentary dimension will be vital to support dialogue, build relationships, and to promote transparency. There are many precedents on which we can draw in designing such a body. For instance, the British-Irish Parliamentary Assembly and the Council of Europe Parliamentary Assembly. There are also precedents on the EU side. And indeed, the EU's March draft agreement included a clause setting up a Parliamentary Partnership Assembly made up of representatives of this Parliament and the European Parliament. And while I don't agree with every word of the EU's proposal, I welcome it as a starting point. When questioned by my committee on the 5th of May, Michael Gove agreed that, and I quote, engagement, discussion and dialogue between parliamentarians is always a good thing, but insisted that it was not for the government to, and I quote again, prescribe exactly how Parliament chooses to operate. So the government has placed the onus upon Parliament to respond to the EU's initiative, And I understand the constitutional propriety of that position. But how, given its large Commons majority, is Parliament to act unless the government takes lead? As chair of your Lordship's committee charged with considering EU matters, I believe very strongly that we need to establish a structured interparliamentary dialogue as part of the future relationship. Indeed, the committee supports the project. So my question to the noble Lord the Minister is, how exactly does the government expect Parliament to signal its support for an interparliamentary body? Will a report from my committee be sufficient, or a joint enterprise with the Future Relationship Committee of the House of Commons? I'm happy to do whatever it takes to try and break this logjam, and I ask the noble Lord the Minister for his help.
The Lord Bishop of Durham.
My Lords, we must consider this report in light of the global pandemic. Decisions about our future relationship with the EU must be informed by COVID-19, recognising our international interdependence rather than driven by ideology. Our European neighbours remain our friends and allies. This must continue for the sake of all, and especially for vulnerable children. Concluding talks by the deadline under present circumstances will be very challenging. I'm particularly concerned about the impact on refugee children and our continued cooperation with European nations through the Dublin Regulation. Can the Minister outline the government's plans to ensure separated asylum-seeking children in Europe continue to be reunited with family members in the UK, whatever happens to negotiations? I'm anxious too about the impact on vulnerable children already here. The success of the EU settled status scheme may be compromised by the pandemic. Local authorities have a duty to apply for their looked-after children. However, the Children's Society found that just 1 in 10 local authorities looked after children have been awarded status. Considering COVID-19, what assessment has Her Majesty's Government made of the feasibility that all looked after children will have applied to the EUSS by June 2021? We must consider if we can achieve a new, fruitful, negotiated relationship with the EU by December under current constraints. Will the government set out criteria against which Parliament can evaluate the progress of negotiations? Does the government accept that any trade deal must be negotiated by October at the latest if it is to be ratified before the deadline? At this time, when businesses are facing significant economic uncertainty, we must be mindful that these negotiations are an additional source of concern.
Lord Cormack.
My Lords, I would like to begin by paying my tribute to my noble friend, Lord Boswell of Ainhoe. And he gave an exemplary speech today, and it was a statesmanlike speech. 2 minutes doesn't give anyone a proper chance to develop an argument. I wish to make a plea and a point. The plea is to my noble friend, Lord True, who will be responding to this debate. And I beg him not to be as dogmatic and dismissive as he was when we had what I believe was the last debate on this general subject in the chamber on the 16th of March. I suggested in that debate that COVID was transforming the political and economic landscape, and that to insist on ending the transition period on the 31st of December was neither necessary nor wise. I believe that everything that has happened in the weeks since that debate on the 16th of March has underlined the good sense of that attitude. And my Lords, the point I wish to make is this: to urge colleagues in all parts of the House to be alert, to the dangers that we face, to be alert to the fact that our negotiations with the EU are not at the top of the agenda either here in the UK or in the EU. We in the United Kingdom have troubles enough at the moment without risking, let alone choosing, the no-deal conclusion to the transition period.
Lord Liddell.
My Lords, I agreed with absolutely everything that Lord Cormac said, and I'd particularly like to underline his tribute to Lord Boswell. I was a member of the European Union Select Committee for much of the time that Lord Boswell was chairman, and it was a very wise chairmanship, and I learnt a lot from him, and I'm very grateful to him. I want to make one simple point in these brief remarks. If we're to have influence in the world, it is very, very important, and this is a key point that the report stresses, that we build strong cooperation with other nations through institutions. Institutions do matter to outcomes in foreign affairs. They create frameworks for regular meetings, they bring officials together, they facilitate instinctive mutual understanding of where other countries stand, and they make common positions easier to forge. And I find it very depressing that the government, in its drastic hardening of Brexit policy, has turned its back on institutional cooperation. It's rejected the possibility of a mechanism for cooperation in foreign affairs, refusing to talk about it. It's rejected an overarching framework for our relationship with the EU through an association agreement. What's gone completely is Mrs. May's notion of a deep and special partnership with the EU. It's been consigned to the dustbin of history. I'm sorry to be harsh, and I hope the Minister will tell me I'm wrong, but I don't think so.
My Lords, during the next speech, I shall be replaced in the chair by Baroness Finlay of Llandaff. Lord Wallace of Saltaire.
My Lords, I hope the Minister can give us some evidence that the government is concerned to win friends in Europe now that we've left the EU. This February's white paper on the future relationship with the EU left out the references that last October's political declaration had agreed to, I quote, an overarching institutional framework for ambitious, close and lasting cooperation in foreign policy and defence, cybersecurity, civil protection and health security. I note the unwise omission this February of cooperation in health security. Now, the protection of national sovereignty overrides questions of national interest and how we might promote national interests through cooperation. The declared intention is to turn away from Europe. The Prime Minister told Parliament on the 3rd of February that, I quote, we are free to reinvigorate our ties with old allies, as if EU membership had cut us off from other partners. So we are leaving our oldest ally, Portugal, behind in the EU. And we leave France, with whom we now share a significant military deployment in sub-Saharan Africa, which the government has told Parliament little about so far. And we put political economic relations with the United States first and foremost, even though we differ from Washington on an increasing number of important global issues. This government has no foreign policy. Beneath the empty phrase of global Britain are buried illusions about a buccaneering Britain in a free trading world released from the shackles of a declining Europe. The current Foreign Secretary has made no attempt to build friendly bilateral relations with our European neighbours, nor has the Prime Minister. But the long history of British foreign policy has been centred on conflict and cooperation with our European neighbours. 120 years after the Marquis of Salisbury stepped down as Conservative Prime Minister, splendid isolation is back.
It's Baroness Finlay of Llandaff here. I'm now in the chair and I call Baroness de Souza.
My Lords, In the last few weeks, ministers in both houses have been repeatedly asked a series of straightforward questions about the ongoing EU-UK negotiations. These questions most often include transparency, specifically of draft legal texts, the establishment of proper interparliamentary channels between the UK and the European Parliament, the role of COVID-19 in hampering the progress of negotiations, and the wisdom of delaying the end date of the 31st of December in the interest of reaching a mutually satisfactory free trade agreement, adherence to the European Convention on Human Rights and the rulings of the European Court. Apart from the last issue, the three other questions have been met with obfuscation, half answers and non-answers. The government's aim, constantly reiterated, is to finalise departure by the end of this year by any means and at any cost. The distance between the time available to reach a satisfactory FTA and the need to abide by the legal requirement to allow Parliament to scrutinise draft agreements is absurdly short. So much so that it appears that despite the UK government's statement to the contrary, a no-deal agreement on World Trade Organization terms is anticipated. This, my lords, would be a disaster. The government's own model and that of independent experts predict that leaving without a trade deal would cost between 6 and 9% of GDP, that is approximately £2,500 per UK citizen. The cost to the Treasury will be in the region of 60 billion, which is 1.5 times our spending on defence. So might I ask the Minister three simple and direct questions? If and when Parliament will be allowed full access to the details of current negotiations, including draft legal texts? If there is no agreement in sight by the end of July 2020, will the government be content to reach December without an FTA? And finally, has the government, following Operation Yellowhammer, updated arrangements in the event of a no-deal final exit from the EU?
Lord Kane.
My Lords, I wish to make two brief points relating to Northern Ireland and Ireland. Northern Ireland has, of course, been central to the Brexit negotiations since the referendum in 2016. And as an advisor at the Northern Ireland office, I was involved in many discussions on these matters. Yet during my time, I became very dismayed at how much the European Commission seemed to view Northern Ireland almost exclusively through the green-tinged lenses of the Irish government and nationalist politicians. Indeed, at a meeting I attended with Monsieur Barnier in June 2018, I found myself calmly having to explain to him what was actually meant by the consent provisions in the Belfast Agreement and why they did not turn Northern Ireland into a hybrid state. It was, I regret to say, my lords, a meeting that might have turned even the noble lords Haney and Kerr into rabid Brexiteers. I do not wish to denigrate the excellent efforts of our officials in Brussels, but whenever there was a difference of nuance between us and the Irish on Northern Ireland or the agreement, the Commission invariably tended towards the Irish view. Outside the EU, attention needs to be given, therefore, as to how the UK government, as the sovereign government in Northern Ireland, can much more effectively communicate its position with the European Commission. Second, as we move beyond Brexit, our relationship with our nearest neighbour, Ireland, becomes more important than ever. Our bilateral relationship has improved massively in recent years, which I warmly welcome, and it needs to be strengthened further. Strand 3 of the Belfast Agreement contains institutions, the British-Irish Intergovernmental Conference and the British-Irish Council, designed to promote closer cooperation, though the BIIGC tends to focus more on Northern Ireland. We need to look at how these institutions can be developed or whether new and bespoke ones are needed. I have an open mind on that, but as we move beyond Brexit, it does need to happen.
Lord Wood of Anfield.
My thanks to Lord Boswell for this debate. I want to ask the Minister 5 very quick questions about the yawning gap between the EU and UK's negotiating positions on the future relationship. First, the political declaration agreed set out the basis for the future relationship, but while the European Commission's position on the negotiations in February adopts the same structure as the political declaration, the UK's negotiating objectives are markedly different. Can the Minister explain why the political declaration framework was so quickly surrendered? Second, can the Minister confirm whether Gibraltar is included in the territorial scope of the agreement automatically, Or will it require, as the Commission believes, the prior agreement of Spain to be included? Third, the EU sees the future EU-UK relationship being encapsulated in an association agreement, which the political declaration also mentions favourably. Is that the UK's aim as well? Fourth, the political declaration agreed to forge an economic partnership that will be underpinned, quote, by provisions ensuring a level playing field for open and fair competition. Does that remain the explicit objective of the UK government as it signed up to in the political declaration? Fifth, on state aid, the UK wants its own regime of subsidy control, but everyone accepts that state aid rules will continue to apply to firms in Northern Ireland after transition, as well as to UK mainland firms with employment activities inside Northern Ireland. So can the Minister acknowledge that the UK's so-called regime of subsidy control will be available and apply only to some UK companies, but far from all? And finally, my lords, we are, as we all know, in the midst of a global crisis of proportions unimaginable just a few weeks ago. With such chasms between the parties on the future relationship discussions, so much attention focused rightly elsewhere, and so much catastrophic disruption of our lives already baked into the next 12 months of our lives, how can it be anything other than reckless to proceed on the existing timescale for concluding a transition deal?
Lord Hannay of Chiswick.
My Lords, when I saw the title of the report we're debating today, and which has been so excellently introduced by my noble friend Lord Boswell, I wondered whether our esteemed EU Select Committee was pulling our collective legs. And then I saw the date of the report, March of last year, and realised it was a report addressed to a different government and in a different parliament, shamefully not debated when it should have been, ahead of our leaving the EU this January. My Lords, the negotiations on our new partnership, and I use the word to which we committed ourselves in the political declaration, and not the government's reductive terminology of a free trade agreement, have begun. But so far they seem to be more a dialogue of the deaf than a prelude to a partnership. And the government seems to be applying social distancing to that political declaration, which provided an agreed framework. Of the bones of contention so far identified, that of the level playing field is in a way bizarre. Bizarre because we agreed in the political declaration to the following wording, I quote, "Given the Union's and the United Kingdom's geographic proximity and economic interdependence, the future relationship must ensure open and fair competition, encompassing robust commitments to ensure a level playing field." Does the government recognise that statement as one to which we subscribe? Then there is the government's determination to avoid an overall agreement, out of a desire, apparently, to guard against the withdrawal of concessions in a different sector to one in dispute. I fear that is futile and doomed to failure. Why? Because under the Swiss deal, the EU has done precisely that, when it found that the Swiss were moving away from free movement, and the EU withdrew access to Erasmus and to research cooperation. And thirdly, the implementation of the Irish Protocol to the withdrawal agreement. Does anyone believe that there can be avoided checks and controls? Obviously like ones, but none at all. So I fear the verdict has to be that we are winning few friends and influencing few people. Why don't we just exempt the rest of the EU from the possible quarantine arrangements if they come here by aeroplane?
Baroness Wheatcroft.
My Lords, I thank Lord Boswell for this excellent report. Reading it provides a very clear reminder of how intertwined the UK is with the EU. After more than 40 years of membership, that's not surprising. But the report is also a reminder of how many issues have to be settled if our final split from the 27 is to be relatively smooth. The political declaration refers to three overarching areas where agreement is necessary: the economic partnership, the security partnership, and the institutional arrangements. Achieving agreement on all that by the end of this year was never going to be easy, but COVID-19 has rendered it virtually impossible. Governments have had to give their full attention to a single priority, and that is tackling the virus. But even if the current fragmentary negotiations could produce a consensus, business is simply not going to be able to cope with radical changes that final departure must bring. My Lords, the UK is no longer a member of the EU. That's not up for debate. But we need to remain in lockstep for a little while longer. Business simply cannot cope with sorting out the effects of the virus while simultaneously preparing for a new, but as yet unknown, relationship with the EU. The transition period has to be extended, as many others have said, and the sooner that happens, the better for business. Government has said that it won't ask for an extension, in part because business needs certainty of the December deadline. My Lords, that is simply nonsense. There is no certainty in a departure into the unknown. The EU 27 share the pressures that a December rupture would create. An extension is in their interest too. If we wish to remain friends, let alone retain influence in the EU, a request for an extension must happen immediately. Could the Minister tell the House why, in the light of the changes wrought by COVID, the government refuses to contemplate extension?
Lord Duncan of Springbank.
My Lords, as a former MEP, a 2-minute speech would be considered a luxury. Let me focus, if I may, upon one single point, which the report itself does not cover in detail, and that would be climate change. The UK has been an active and indeed a leading participant in the EU's endeavours to address climate change. And with the postponement of the COP26 gathering in Glasgow for another year, we have an opportunity to reconcile and resolve our relationship with the EU. There are certain elements where we can do good, and there are certain areas where by sharing we can help all within the EU. We're in the middle of a crisis right now in terms of the pandemic, but perhaps the greater challenge of all is how to interweave our ambitions moving forward to address the wider challenges of climate change. I'm specifically concerned about our relationship with the emissions trading scheme, and I'd welcome some detail upon that, perhaps not at this moment, but in the future. I do believe right now that we have an opportunity at COP26 in Glasgow to demonstrate leadership, but I think we should do so together with the EU. I think together we can achieve more, particularly in the area of climate change. Thank you.
Baroness Smith of Newnham.
My Lords, like other noble peers, I would like to thank the noble Lord Boswell, for his chairmanship of your Lordship's EU Select Committee. He, by his personality and role, was able to demonstrate how one can win friends and influence people. The role of individuals as well as parliaments is very important in cooperation and building up relationships. My Lords, in the excellent report, the committee noted that the EU will need to adapt quickly, working harder and more strategically to make use of all available tools to maximise its voice in Brussels and beyond. This in turn requires a long-term commitment of energy, time and financial and human resources. Could the noble Lord the Minister tell us whether he believes Her Majesty's government is delivering on those requirements? And that's in particular the case in the context of the COVID-19 crisis. The government's report clearly says changes have been made in Brussels. Could the noble Lord the Minister explain to us the nature of the changes and what advice the government has sought in terms of the best sort of mission to have in Brussels for a third country? Has the government, for example, taken advice from our friends in Iceland or Norway who have extensive experience of being third countries? Finally, my Lords, does the government accept that in order to be influential, we need to go beyond the sterile debates that we've had so far, and perhaps also beyond Pontignano and Königswinter? They don't really contribute on their own civil society. So could the government commit to supporting exchange mechanisms and continuation of schemes like Erasmus?
Lord Kirkhope of Harrogate.
My Lords, as others have suggested, a lot of water has flowed under the bridge since this report was published. Indeed, that large amount of water is, metaphorically speaking, now sitting behind a dam wall while we all wait to see if the wall will hold or the dam will burst at the end of this year. As a former MEP, I'm conscious of the critical situation that exists between the UK and the EU, where it's clear to most people that it is vital that we reach agreement covering many things, including the environment, trade, agriculture and fisheries, and security. The last one is of particular interest to me, as it is where I was involved for many years in my work in the European Union. I think it's vital to ensure a strong level of cooperation between member states to protect their citizens. The government seems confident that in these and other areas we can achieve good outcomes quickly. In security, there can be no maybe. We cannot afford to leave any vacuum, especially if the virus crisis produces more opportunities for those that might do us harm. But, my lords, no amount of treaties, protocols, understandings and agreements can suffice alone. We have also to ensure that in order to have good and harmonious relationships with our European neighbours in future, we must really want that from our hearts as well as from our heads. Many young people especially look to a future where Europeans can continue to enjoy each other's company and benefit from shared interests and aspirations. So in the next few weeks and months, my lords, we need to display not only negotiating skills, but a high level of positivism, good nature, diplomacy and pragmatism. And I really hope that our leaders will deliver on that.
Lord Judd.
My lords, I want to join with those who've paid a tribute to Lord Boswell for this very helpful, indeed excellent report, and indeed take this opportunity of saying how much we should all appreciate his dedicated work on the European scene for so long. My lords, the work of the European committees becomes more important than ever. It's vital. I believe, I'm totally convinced that governments will be judged in history by their effectiveness in playing a dynamic part in international cooperation. Because the first reality of life, of humanity itself, is that we are demonstrably totally interdependent. And we must therefore face the fact that the major issues that affect us, whether it be COVID-19, climate change, security, Ireland, migration, economic stability itself, cannot be successfully handled but on an international cooperative basis. My lords, what I'm concerned about is where is the evidence that the government understands this? Where is the evidence that the government have made it central to their whole approach to governance? What is the evidence, for example, of what the government is doing with European allies to combat the ugly and sinister jingoistic nationalism, which is now, unfortunately, raising its head again in Europe, and indeed in the United States and elsewhere in the world? My lords, it is by international cooperation and effectiveness, not least with our European allies, although we are no longer part of the European Union, that our future depends. Anything less is to betray our people.
Lord Brewers.
My lords, I compliment the European Committee and Lord Boswell on this report. I agree with all that it says, but would like to suggest that it should have said more, especially about the continued participation for the UK in the new European Education, Science and Innovation programmes. These programmes include Erasmus, already mentioned by Baroness Smith, Horizon Europe, those of the European Research Council and the European Research Infrastructure Consortiums. In this report, the words Erasmus and Horizon only appear in footnotes and in a diagram, although reference is made to the February 2019 European Committee's comprehensive report on Erasmus and Horizon. Overall, however, they do not receive the prominence they deserve in this report. Our future competitiveness as a modern nation will depend to a huge extent on the skills of our citizens in all spheres of endeavour, and our economic survival will rely on the application of modern advances in engineering and science. It seems we have successfully negotiated our continuance in Horizon 2020 through its conclusion in 2021, but the situation with Horizon Europe remains unclear. This programme has a budget of 100 billion euros, and even more important than the money will be our involvement in the partnerships that this would provide. Modern advances in science, and especially in innovation, can only be made through collaboration. It is an inherently global activity, and success is strongly influenced by proximity. So a large fraction of our collaborations have been with our European neighbours. Our engineers and scientists know each other. There is a lot of mutual admiration and a lot of successful collaboration. Let's make sure this continues. Many pages of the report are devoted to the specialist committees and their importance, but I could not find any committees devoted specifically to our collaborations on education, science and engineering, whose members were engineers and scientists. I would like to ask the Minister to assure us that the government is committed to do all it can to preserve as many of our educational and scientific collaborations with Europe as possible.
Lord Moynihan.
My Lords, I also welcome the European Union Committee report, which makes a series of excellent recommendations. One area of particular importance to me is the necessity for ongoing cooperation between the UK and many European entities, which impact sport and recreation throughout this country and the European Union. The sport contributes £37 billion to our economy, with 581,000 employed, of which 31,000 are European nationals. And we must take advantage of new methods now of exerting influence on the EU after the transition period. We will need to build close relationships with the EU committees, which impact sport and recreation at all levels, and where relevant, use the UK's diplomatic representation to the EU to exert influence, and where necessary, and it will be necessary, my Lords, not least in dealing with the fallout from the Bosman, Cotonou and Colpack rules. We must finalise and then monitor and retain reciprocal arrangements which enable skilled workers, for example in seasonal sports such as skiing, to pursue employment. And sport is also a major soft power tool for promoting our products and services and indeed our reputation within the European Union. We need ongoing relationships to make it easy for fans and visitors from the EU to travel to and from the UK. UK sports bodies currently benefit from UK funding, European Union funding as well as UK funding, but they build knowledge and they share good practice with their European colleagues. And I urge government to look at ways of retaining relationships with the relevant institutions and committees to seek continued dialogue and involvement with UK and European Union programmes which benefit sport and recreation to our mutual advantage. We are inextricably linked to the world of sport and recreation in Europe, not least with the tripartite agreement with Ireland and France on which the future of horse racing in this country will depend. We must win friends and influence people to ensure a win-win relationship in the future.
Lord Campbell of Pittenweem.
My Lords, the unwillingness of the government, and indeed its refusal to countenance any extension beyond the 31st of December is irresponsible, not least because it leaves open the possible catastrophic outcome of no deal whatsoever. And I ask myself, what is the Prime Minister afraid of? He now has a majority of 80 in the House of Commons, and the Remainers, many of whom have spoken in this debate already, are silenced. After the virus crisis, we shall need friends and influence in Europe. But most of all, now we need the best possible trade deal that can be achieved. And it is no use looking to President Trump, as people frequently do. Current American unemployment and Joe Biden's lead in the polls will mean that Mr. Trump, once again, will be based on America first, and indeed, you might say, second and third as well. My Lords, the Prime Minister has a long and undistinguished record of changing his mind for his own interests. He should change his mind on this occasion for the public interest.
Lord Ricketts.
My Lords, it's great to have Lord Boswell's wisdom again at the opening of this debate. I want to focus on the crucial area of justice and security cooperation with the EU, because that has a direct impact on the safety and security of British people. And yet we've heard very little about what is happening in the negotiations on that. There is no off-the-peg, oven-ready security arrangement available with the EU. Different countries have different levels of access. Norway and Iceland come closest, but then they are in the Schengen area. Even if Britain could get a deal as good as Norway and Iceland, it would only provide what a British government document called in 2018 limited patchwork of cooperation with a serious shortfall in capability. So logically, we need an even closer security relationship than Norway and Iceland. It can't be the government objective that we should leave the EU and become less safe. And yet the February command paper devoted only 4 rather brief pages to this vital area. What are the prospects of negotiating an unprecedented level of security cooperation with the EU in the coming weeks? The answer is we simply don't know. Michael Gove told the EU committee last week he hoped for an agreement, largely, I think, on the basis that we have been a considerable provider of security information to the EU. But this seemed to depend on the EU being willing to scrap its own red lines. My Lords, this is not an area where EU leaders can simply cut us a political deal. These are legal instruments with specific obligations. Given the importance of this area for national security, could the Minister give us some indication of when the government will break its radio silence about the negotiations on justice and security, and what contingency plans they are making in case there is no future relationship agreement and we fall off a security cliff edge 7 months from now?
Lord Howard of Rising.
My Lords, the committee's wish to remain friendly with the EU is laudable, but it is difficult to see how this noble aim can be achieved when EU negotiators treat the UK as if it is a colony and not a sovereign nation, and the EU persists in making unreasonable demands. Britain still being under the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice until the 31st of December may contribute to this attitude. This jurisdiction is overlooked by those suggesting extending trade negotiations. It is an important point. Ultimate legal authority is the essence of sovereignty, and the British people, who have consistently voted to leave the European Union, would resent any extension of the ECJ jurisdiction. What would also make any extension horribly catastrophic is the recent refusal by the German courts to accept the authority of the European Court of Justice. The knock-on effect of this will be to impose strict limits on quantitative easing by the European Central Bank. Instead of printing money, money will have to be found, billions of euros. An extension after the 31st of December would keep Britain under the European Court of Justice. This means we would be obliged to contribute unlimited funds to EU bailout schemes with no say on either the amount or the timing. Getting into such a situation would create friction and impede any sort of friendly relations.
Lord Morris of Aberavon.
My Lord, my first point is the issue of costs. If the government changes its mind, inevitable as it seems, about leaving the EU in December for the transition period. We have been told that this is not a matter of ideology, but practicality. However, it is a political necessity as the government's credibility is at stake. Mr. Cove told the Commons Committee on the 27th of April that it would cost billions of pounds if we sought an extension. I have no doubt if the past negotiating stance of the EU is repeated, they would demand their pound of flesh. They have a big black hole to fill in their future budgets. But what does billions of pounds mean if we sought an extension of up to 1 or 2 years? Have we asked them? All negotiations will be virtual. As I understand it, no physical presence is envisaged. Coronavirus has changed the whole atmosphere and political situation in Europe. It won't be easy to make negotiations in the next year. I would like to know something more than what Mr. Gove says. Merely trumpeting the word billions of pounds is not good enough. My second point arises from what Lord Folk says about the devolved governments. Paragraph 96 of the report speaks of enhanced role for the devolved governments. What does this mean? Are they anything more than warm words to keep the devolved governments quiet? The committee argue firmly that they should be involved at summit, ministerial, and technical level, as envisaged in the political declaration. The government, indeed, of Cardiff would be very interested, and all the other devolved administrations, in an explanation of what is envisaged by the government in the words enhanced role. Thank you.
Baroness Randerson.
The government's behaviour, my lords, in the current talks is the antithesis of the approach recommended in this report. Just because the virus has eclipsed Brexit as an issue in the news, it doesn't mean that the problem has gone away. And EU's diplomats have been very studied in their understatement when they summed up the negotiations by calling them disappointing. But beneath that, there is a realism that the government, the UK government, is deliberately wasting time. Phil Hogan, the European Trade Commissioner, has stated that the UK government believe that they can hide the Brexit economic fallout by blaming the virus for everything. And he's undoubtedly right. A no-deal Brexit was always going to be an economic disaster. But as we face the deepest recession for 300 years, according to the Bank of England, it would be reckless in the extreme. As the Times put it yesterday, it would be unhinged. Already the government has been forced to backtrack, for instance, on the attempts to go it alone on PPE. We need our international neighbours now more than ever. And in the worst crisis for 3/4 of a century, the Prime Minister needs to realise that the best leaders are those who can adapt to circumstances. He needs the strength of character to acknowledge that it's wrong to cling to the idea of getting negotiations done by the end of this year. If the UK is to win friends and to maintain our influence internationally, he must seek a 2-year extension.
The Earl of Sandwich.
My lords, I agree. The VE Day anniversary reminded us yet again how closely knit our history is with our European neighbours. We've all lost family members in the last war, and we must strain every sinew to ensure that we continue to build a peaceful Europe from now on. Europe is looking to us for some real leadership in the negotiations, and today's debate provides a new occasion for Europe to meet all its old friends in this virtual chamber. The battles have ended. Euroscepticism in our parliament, I believe, is getting out of date.
We must revive the political declaration, as others have said, during this transition year, to retain the very best elements of our relationship. Look at what has happened during the pandemic. See how we've been comparing our results daily with those of our European friends. And we've not come out particularly well in the comparison. But we needed to situate ourselves within Europe, not on some land mass out in the Atlantic. I congratulate the government on weathering the pandemic and on apparently entering the EU negotiations with goodwill. There has not been a lot of progress, but we are at least fielding a strong team and we must get on with it. Does the Minister remember the violence of the Cod War? And does he think, for example, we're making enough effort to find an agreement in fisheries? We will also have an enormous job in the EU committees from now on in the scrutiny of treaties. The recent Parliament and Brexit report from UCL and many others state plainly that Parliament is not yet adequate to the task of scrutinising the increasing number of treaties. This is primarily a matter for this House, and I declare an interest as a member of the new treaties subcommittee. But the government must also show some restraint, and indeed its close cooperation with both houses will be the best way to achieve this scrutiny. And I hope we can live up to the legacy of Lord Boswell.
Lord Balfe.
My Lords, can I begin by thanking Lord Boswell for his report? I'm sorry we didn't debate it a good time ago, but at last we're here, and I congratulate him on his distinguished chairing of the Europe Committee. The report is called How to Win Friends and Influence People, and I want to concentrate on that because one area is where the present government party has made a complete mess of winning friends and influencing people. The only member of the Parliamentary Assembly to the Council of Europe taking part in this debate is Lord Fuchs, and I assure him I'm not implicating the Labour Party. We sent 36 people to Strasbourg. They are about half of them British Conservatives. I'm afraid that the way in which they behave there is, shall we say, not designed to increase the influence of Great Britain. And in particular, our leader, or the chairman of the Conservative group, Ian Littlegranger, together with Sir Roger Gale, who at the beginning of this year invited the Alternative for Germany, the AFD, to join the Conservative group. So in Strasbourg today, at a time when we're looking to influence governments all around Europe, what we have is the British Conservatives allied with the AFD, the Holocaust deniers, the racists, and what are we going to say to Conservative friends of Israel and to the Jewish community? We have rightly condemned the Labour Party in the past. I'm pleased at what Keir Starmer is now doing. But really, Minister, if you have any influence, you must realise this does us absolutely no good, and it's time for the Conservative whip and the Conservative leadership to intervene, stop pretending this doesn't matter, and get us out of this alliance with near-fascists.
Lord McConnell of Glennscorodale.
Thank you. I too would like to thank the Noble Lord Boswell for his introduction to this debate, but also for the way in which, while chairing the European Union Committee of your Lordship's House, he consistently sought to include the interests of the devolved nations of the United Kingdom in the deliberations of the committee and the recommendations in the committee's reports. And that is true of this report as much as it has been of predecessor reports. And I'd like to particularly address recommendations 17, 2021, 37 and 4142. All of them stress the importance of engaging properly with the devolved governments and the devolved parliaments of the United Kingdom. Since 1999 and the creation of devolution in the UK, there was a strong engagement, consistent with the previous engagement, the Welsh office and the old Scottish office, in UK delegations, in prior discussions, and in ongoing technical work around EU legislation. That should continue after Brexit, in the way that it did in the early years of devolution, when we were fully engaged in delegations, fully engaged in UK decision-making, and fully engaged at the technical level too. But also in relation to the parliaments, I noticed the specific recommendation that there should be consideration given to members of the devolved parliaments participating in any parliamentary assembly. I think the parliaments in Holyrood, in Cardiff, and in Belfast should automatically be part of the delegation alongside the House of Lords and the House of Commons. And I think that would be a positive step to repair some of the damage that's been done over the past decade in inter-UK relations.
Lord Purvis of Tweed.
My Lords, in our recent debate on economic forecasts led by the Minister, we had 3 minutes to speak, and Baroness Noakes from the Conservative benches said this: "This is not accountability, this is a sham. The sooner we return to normal proceedings without the excessive time limiting that has been introduced, the better." I agree with her. So in the limited time, I want to address trade. It is not protecting our interests or persuading others to align to them by setting aside pragmatic and practical cooperation, such as that described by the former chairman in his speech. The government has set this aside, and instead our future EU and global trading relationship is highlighted by glib self-deception. In January, at the Africa Investment Summit, the Prime Minister said to bemused African leaders that with Brexit, Northern Ireland chicken would be enjoyed in Angola and Ugandan beef on our Sunday lunch tables. Portugal, Belgium, Italy, and Spain already export more meat to Angola, and Ugandan beef cannot be imported to the UK because of health standards. For the US discussions in March, the PM said we would be trading salmon for Stetsons, but ignoring the recent restrictions on processed fish into the US announced by the American administration. These are the glib elements, and no doubt have some comic effect, but they are illustrative and they speak to a greater truth, and they are noticed by the EU and the world. The self-deception is that such new trading with outside the European Union, reflecting less than 0.1% growth of GDP over a 15-year period, that is believed to offset a 4.7% reduction in productivity according to the OBR because of disruption to our main trading bloc. The Minister didn't answer or write to me after the debate on economic forecasts to my simple question, so let me try again. What is the government's core assumption of the impact on UK trade from January 2020 of its current EU policy and taking all new agreements made into context? Without honesty and openness, we will never protect our interests to align others to them, and pragmatism replaced by politics, of which one will be influenced only by the other acolytes. This is not the future that's the benefit for our country.
Viscount Brookborough.
My Lords, I also thank the noble Lord Boswell. The title of the report includes How to Win Friends and Influence People. Influencing people is more probable by making greater friends, and international cooperation is about friendship between people and nations. Living on the border with the Republic of Ireland, we are so aware of the importance of cross-border relations and friendships at every level. These links have been severely damaged by the Troubles, lack of devolved government, and now Brexit at government level. 75 years ago, at the time of VE Day, respect and friendship for this country was unsurpassed. Where has that skill of creating friendships gone? What of diplomacy? We were slow to join the EU, but in joining, we lost many friends, especially in the Commonwealth, creating trade barriers and restricting immigration. The UK then became one of the most enthusiastic for its expansion, allowing countries like Greece entry without fulfilling their financial criteria required. We were leaders in inviting the Central European states to join. After all this, we are now the first to be fighting our way out of the EU. Presently, we have angered our greatest friend, the US, by our dealings with Huawei. During about 20 years on various EU committees, I was always so impressed by the welcome and friendship shown to us in Brussels and other European capitals. The committees and reports were always held in the highest esteem, mainly due to the leadership of chairmen, such as the noble Lords Lord Boswell and Lord Canute. Now, in contrast, it seemed that this was not quite the same for the Commons. Perhaps the other place did not place as much importance on the work of the EU. One eminent MP described to me that appointment to those committees as rather like being put in the sin bin. It is not always a matter of what we do, but how we do it. And that means winning friends and keeping them. I ask the Minister how the government is going to improve working relationships within the EU and, very importantly, worldwide.
Baroness Faulkner of Margravine.
My Lords, I too was a member of the committee under Lord Boswell's chairmanship, and I think it's no understatement to say that his outstanding tenure was undoubtedly the most eventful period in the committee's history, and he led us through it most ably. My Lords, given this report has been overtaken by events, I want to concentrate on the government's negotiations and aims as set out in their February 2020 command paper. That sets out 5 areas where the Joint Committee in Dispute Resolution Systems will not apply. These are mainly in areas where the EU, we know, is particularly concerned about a level playing field. Now, I can see the need for the United Kingdom to have regulatory autonomy, particularly as the COVID-related economic shock that will result is going to lead to EU states adapting differentially to technological change and automation. And that's going to impact some of those areas where the EU particularly wants a level playing field very directly. So while I can see that the government's right in principle, I would urge them to retain a form of joint dialogue in a structured format, as we'll need to have some common approaches to these problems, particularly in terms of our competition policy and our policy in terms of countries that have been blatantly shown to be playing by a different rulebook. Finally, let me turn to financial services, where we're told that in that report that the equivalent assessments are separate from the FTA, and they're expected to be completed in June 2020. Could the Minister confirm that that timetable still holds? And if not, when are they likely to conclude those assessments? As you'll appreciate, they're terribly important for our financial services sector to get on with the end of transition.
Lord Bowness.
Thank you. My Lords, I too congratulate the noble Lord Boswell, and indeed his successor, the Earl of Kinnoul, on the work of the European Union Committee, and in particular this report. I agree with its recommendations. I think, however, it would have been a little more fruitful if we had actually been discussing a report upon the withdrawal agreement and political declaration negotiated by the present Prime Minister. My questions really arise out of the changes which were made in that withdrawal agreement and what has happened subsequent to the election. My question to my noble friend, the Minister, is what does the government actually believe is the status of the withdrawal agreement of the political declaration negotiated with much fanfare by the present Prime Minister? What's happened to the close relationships that were envisaged in the opening paragraphs of that political declaration? What has happened to the matters referred to by the noble Lord Ricketts about police and criminal justice cooperation, police and civil and judicial cooperation, all being replaced now by our own new legislation? We are told that what we are aiming for by the end of December is a simple free trade agreement. Well, a simple free trade agreement, my Lords, will not, in my view, cover any of those issues. And indeed, the question is, will it cover services? Why? And I say to my noble friend, the Minister, and I hope that this is a question on this occasion he will answer me, why, in the light of the current circumstances and the likely economic fallout of coronavirus, do we not accept that circumstances have changed and seek the extension which all reasonable people, in my view, would want? This is not trying to reverse Brexit. This is trying to make things better for the United Kingdom as we go forward I regret to say, my lords, I have no confidence in the way the government are dealing with this particular issue.
Lord Lee of Crondall.
My lords, is it not becoming quite a likely consequence of the government's present policy that they will be responsible for breaking up the United Kingdom? 2, is it not a fact that Lord Howard of Rising couldn't be more wrong in characterising the EU as not negotiating in good faith? Is it not the case that Mr. Barnier has put his finger on it when he points out that it's we, not they, who have moved the goalposts as regards the content of the political declaration, which we presumably signed in good faith? Number 3, has not 2020 demonstrated 2 or 3 major points? 1, that we can't rely on the United States any more than we can rely on China. And is it not palpable nonsense that we think that it is an advantage to be able to go in the direction of saying Britain gives the lead, rather than Britain is helping to compare ourselves with best practice in the European area? And ought we not to stay within the European economic area compatible with leaving the EU?
The Duke of Montrose.
My lords, I also congratulate my noble friend Lord Boswell on securing this debate. We urgently need to complete the structures of our new relationship with the EU, and a vital focus needs to be what kind of friendship and influence are we seeking? We have just celebrated VE Day. My lords, as a boy, I believed all the belligerent rhetoric of that war and reveled in the news of the destruction of our enemies. But VE Day is a reminder that actually, at a time of great peril, Britain gave its all for Europe out of a friendship that wanted the best for others as well as for ourselves. Later, it was a revelation for me to travel across France in 1946 with my family and see the devastation of the cities. In Paris, we caught the moment where, for the first night since the liberation, the Notre Dame was fully floodlit. On that journey, I met people from other countries that had suffered intolerably, learning something of their hopes and intentions. But I came aware of the gigantic leap of faith that was required as the likes of Adenauer, Schumann, and de Gasperi began to draw together people who had regarded each other as enemies in a process that culminated in the Treaty of Rome. For a number of years, I was involved in a program of reconciliation in Europe and elsewhere, which gave me much more appreciation of the divides that had to be bridged. The coronavirus presents an equal challenge to us and our neighbours. I back the theme of other noble lords that Britain should try to ensure that Europe as a whole is working towards greater inclusion of the developing world. We still need to recognise that much of our original wealth came from these regions, and they rightly expect the creation of a just economic order.
Baroness Ritchie of Downpatrick.
My lords, I welcome the report and the references to the need for the EU and the UK to establish effective channels of communication and cooperation, plus the need to respect the Good Friday Agreement in order not to weaken the confidence of unionist and nationalist communities in the political process. Unfortunately, I am afraid to say, but the UK government is not engaging properly with the EU and with that pragmatic intent that Lord Kirkhope talked about to resolve issues, to ensure, in our particular case where I live, the full implementation of the Northern Ireland Protocol. And if I may use 2 examples to show where the government has not properly negotiated with true intent. One is the issue of the transition. To obtain that good deal, that effective deal, there needs to be an extension of that transition period by 2 years in this period of the pandemic. And the further reason is one where there's been a refusal by the UK to allow the EU to have a technical office in Belfast to allow the implementation of the protocol, so the proper procedures can be put in place to deal with those customs arrangements at the ports and to provide for that unfettered access for business. And because of the shortness of time, I would ask the noble Lord, the Minister, to address both those issues and also to ensure, working with colleagues, that that respect and that pragmatism and that level of cooperation returns to the negotiations to achieve an effective deal. Thank you.
Lord Bruce of Benaki.
My Lords, I don't believe any rational person should want anything but a friendly, influential relationship with our neighbours. We have a government, however, ideologically committed to a hard Brexit and pushing for UK exceptionalism, just as nationalists everywhere do. But we're now engulfed with COVID-19. This can neither be a cover nor a scapegoat for a destructive version of Brexit. The EU have produced a negotiating proposal of 440 pages, and we have no idea what our government's response to that is. We now need practical steps for future engagement. The Northern Ireland Protocol, agreed, requires customs declaration for exports for Northern Ireland to the rest of the UK. Having denied this, Prime Minister in particular, will the government now acknowledge it and provide help and support to Northern Ireland businesses to handle the extra bureaucracy this will require? The crunch of Brexit may be on the island of Ireland, but the rest of the UK is looking for positive answers on many other areas. For example, there is scope, it's been mentioned, for continuing engagement in Horizon and Erasmus, involving contribution and access to funding. But researchers and students want to know now what the government proposes. Is the Minister going to be able to tell us? Our financial services have lost passporting rights, but they want optimal equivalence and a longer-term understanding of how our financial services can still engage with EU customers. Can the government give us any guidance on that? Professional and business services providers want to know if their qualifications will be recognised. A joint committee along the lines recommended by the committee has been established, but it's by no means clear how active or engaged it's going to be, or whether it will continue or transform after agreement is reached, assuming agreement is reached. We need constructive relations between our Parliament and the European Parliament and the national parliaments of the EU. So will the government support the establishment of a parliamentary joint committee as recommended by the committee, the EU committee? And the EU has said they're prepared to include the UK in future meetings of COSAC. Does the government support that? Please, can we have some answers?
Lord Kerr of Kinlochard.
The poet said it's good to see ourselves as others see us, and we should perhaps consider why we're now so mistrusted across the Channel. In my 2 minutes, 2 reasons. First, the perception increasingly is that we're not implementing the Irish deal. 7 months on, only 7 months to go, no consultation, no draft legislation, no staff recruitment, no procurement of IT or no construction of infrastructure, and apparently, as Baroness Ritchie noted, no office for the 27 in Belfast, though the Chinese have got one. Our friends will remember Mr. Johnson in denial that his deal entails a two-way EU trade frontier in the Irish Sea, though it's spelt out in his treaty. They now suspect he plans to persist in prevarication, forcing them back to the inner Irish border and blaming Brussels for what that would do to the Good Friday Agreement. Our good faith is being called in question. Second reason, we've rejected the 27's proposals for a new relationship based on the joint declaration. We won't let the Commission show the 27 our counter proposals, odd tactics if we're looking to win friends. get some influence. We've repudiated the level playing field concept that we had agreed in the joint declaration, and we've encouraged the perception we'd be happy to have no deal. As Baroness Randerson pointed out, the increasing perception across the Channel is that we aim to conceal under cover of the virus-led recession the self-harm done by our new and narrowly autarkic definition of sovereignty. Our old friends suspect that's why we reject an extension of the transition period. The virus cover only works if the crash out is quick. The 27 know that the virus means there can't be a comprehensive free trade agreement by December, as Baroness Wheatcroft pointed out. They know that. They can't believe that Mr. Johnson doesn't know it, so they question our good faith. My lords, we're increasingly seen as irresponsible and untrustworthy. We're not behaving as did all the governments for whom I was proud to work. It's very sad, and worse than sad, it's shaming.
My lords, after the speech by Lord MP, Lord Palmer of Charles Hill will take over the chair. And I'll call Lord MP.
My lords, the report talks about winning friends and influencing people, and I believe that one of the key requirements for that is a strong and growing diplomatic push by the United Kingdom throughout the world. From 2017-18, even after the EU referendum, the United Kingdom started to cut back the resources that it was putting into our diplomatic service. And in fact, the Foreign Office was one of the few departments that was getting really hit hard by the budgets. Can the Minister assure the House that there will be adequate efforts made to build up our diplomatic capability, which was once in the best in the world? And yet we're now confronted with the fact that we need it even more, but I believe it has been starved of resources. Many members have already mentioned the position in Ireland. I never thought I would see a Conservative and Unionist government agree to a border in the Irish Sea, and indeed to try and pretend that our position in the rest of the United Kingdom is not altered by the events contained in the protocol is misleading. It does make a huge change, but by using the existing structures of the Good Friday Agreement and adapting them, I believe, as my noble friend Lord Kane said earlier in the debate, I believe we have a mechanism at our disposal that we can find a way of resolving these matters without damaging the Union. But whatever the United Kingdom does, it must ensure that its international capability diplomatically is reinforced and not cut back.
Baroness Noakes.
My Lords, I was a member of the EU committee when this report was published, and I pay tribute, as other noble lords have done, to the leadership of the noble Lord, Lord Boswell, when he chaired the committee. The report was published last year against the backdrop of the previous Prime Minister struggling and failing to get Parliament to approve her withdrawal agreement. Parliament was working against us leaving the EU. Last December, the British people gave the government a very clear mandate to get Brexit done. We now have a strong Prime Minister and a Parliament, at least in the other place, committed to delivering the will of the people. Inevitably, some of the committee's recommendations have not stood the test of time. We've now left the EU, and the government are working at speed on the long-term relationship with the EU, including a free trade agreement. The government are committed to bringing this to a conclusion by the end of the year, and I was glad to hear my noble friend Lord True last week confirm that the government have no intention of extending the transition period. There is clearly no time to spare in these negotiations. This is the new context for parliamentary scrutiny. Parliament must, of course, still undertake its constitutional role of holding the government to account. But in this new timescale, Parliament cannot realistically expect to be involved in the detailed negotiations of our long-term relationship with the EU. To that extent, I regard the EU Committee's proposals, for example, on its desired involvement in the workings of the Joint Committee, as time expired. My Lords, let us focus on holding the government to account on what they achieve in practice, rather than on the detailed steps for getting there.
Thank you. Lord Berkeley.
My Lords, I too congratulate the noble Lord Boswell on this and his committee on this excellent report. It's taken a long time to see the light of debate, but it does emphasise the really important role that discussions working together informally as well as formally can achieve when one's trying to ensure that relationships remain as they should do with the rest of Europe. Years ago, I was on the European Committee, and then more recently, I've rejoined the Goods Committee. So this is of great interest to me as we go forward. It's particularly interesting then to see Michael Gove's one-page statement dated the 28th of April about the progress of negotiations. It was good to see that trade and goods justified a couple of lines. Fisheries will, I think, be extremely difficult. Transport, aviation and road haulage are mentioned along with passenger transport, but where is rail? Rail isn't mentioned at all. There's no interest, apparently, in what the manufacturers might want, the services, safety, standards for passenger and freight. And there's no ever been mention of associate membership of the European Railway Association, even though, European Railway Agency, even though the similar agencies for maritime and air have been accepted in part by the government. I wonder whether the Minister could explain why this omission. I heard some time ago that the reason for omitting rail from the European Railway Agency was because it had the word Europe in the title. So, my Lords, I think we have to ask ourselves, what does the government want? For what purpose? For whose benefit? Is it just dogma or just wasting time? And I think we have a long way to go before we can justify spending 60 billion on a no deal, while at the same time spending 40 to 80 billion on the coronavirus this year. Is it all necessary?
Lord Oates.
My Lords, I regret the derisively short time available to address the important points in this report. This is a consequence of decisions made by the Lords Commission, which have allowed technology to dictate function, have arbitrarily curtailed the length of time for debates, and have created perverse speaking incentives, resulting in absurdly short speaking times on critically important issues. Far from protecting the reputation of the House of Lords, these decisions make a mockery of our constitutional duty to hold the executive to account, and they must be revisited. At this moment, our scrutiny role is needed more than ever, and in the short time I want to focus on the position of Northern Ireland. In its response to the Select Committee report, the government stated that it would ensure that the views of business in Northern Ireland, and I quote, are represented in discussions and will inform the implementation of the protocol. However, when the Select Committee recently visited Northern Ireland, they found that far from that being the case, businesses were deeply frustrated at the lack of engagement by the UK government with their concerns. These concerns included a lack of knowledge about how the protocol will work, lack of time to prepare for it to become operational, a default position that goods passing from GB to NI will be deemed at risk of passing into the single market, and the lack of clarity over unfettered access for NI goods to GB. They told the committee that the requirements for GB-NI movement seem far beyond what seems plausible as a business model. My Lords, it's time for the government to stop indulging in ideological obsessions and time to start listening to businesses and providing answers to their increasingly urgent questions, particularly at this time of great pressure on them from the COVID economic crisis.
Viscount Waverley.
This is an important report and requires comprehensive consideration. Fostering relationships, working for certainty, is key to the UK's future in this complex, uncertain world. Applicable to beyond the EU as within, engagement, trust building, negotiation and agreement is key. And I remain forever hopeful that conditions can be met to reset a number of relationships. It is the sum of 4 strands that make up relevant relationships: government, both central and local, parliamentary, private sector and civil society, including culture exchange and soft power. Central government's role must be to uphold standards and exercise its mind on such matters as national security, but importantly to coordinate the other components. It does not have, after all, a monopoly on relations. And running with the theme of the Noble Earl Lord Canul, the report underlines the essential need for parliamentary scrutiny and engagement. Enhanced interparliamentary dialogue could serve a real purpose. However, the UK's APPG movement requires an urgent overhaul. Their role and that of the IPU and CPA should be properly funded and not be a single focus group, so as to become an effective advisory to government. Chairs and officers should be selected for their approach to being even-handed, but will government take parliamentarians seriously, or does it believe itself to be a centralised cabal? In my time as chairman of the APPGs of the 5 states in Central Asia, I endeavoured to make the groups meaningful by signing cooperation agreements with opposite numbers to underline the importance on the broadest range of priorities, from security, environment, climate, trade, human rights and others, including that of parliamentary exchanges, possibly a process that could become a model moving forward. Thank you.
Lord Cavendish or Furness.
My Lords, notwithstanding time constraints, I must also thank the Noble Lord, Lord Boswell, both for his opening speech and for his outstanding chairmanship of the committee that authored this report. I should very much like to have discussed many aspects of the report, and especially the need to enhance diplomatic representation, as discussed in paragraph 79, and the importance of rebuilding bridges. But in the light of the continuing calls for an extension to the transition period, I feel bound to give my reasons for asking the government to resist such calls unambiguously. An extension would not be in the best interests of this country. First, it would blight new trade negotiations and prevent deals already under negotiation from coming into force. Second, negotiations for the EU's new multi-annual financial settlement starts in 2021. It's expected to include vast fiscal stimulus package and accompanying legislative programmes to shore up an already ailing Eurozone. Having left the EU, we are likely to find ourselves burdened with massive financial liabilities and being bound by laws over which we have no say in shaping. Such laws are hardly likely to be framed to serve our interests. Third, and regardless of what the Noble Lord, Lord Lee thinks, the EU are seeking to impose conditions on us less favourable than those that other countries enjoy. If this impasse leads to a breakdown in talks in the coming days, the failure will not be of our making. Offering an extension would be an act of irresponsible self-harm. When we put behind us this tragic pestilence, let us reject protectionism that rewards the rich and harms the poor. History, even recent history, shows that free trade enriches and liberates all people and all countries. Let us embrace it now.
Baroness Bowles of Berkhamsted.
My Lords, beyond the time when we must follow EU rules, engagement and influence remains important. That's common sense wherever we have large trading relationships, but there is nowhere in the world more open and organised for receiving input than the EU. Beyond committees and agencies, Brussels is awash with consultations, conferences and evidence sessions. Good speakers are sought from around the world, and a well-presented case can be very influential. It's serious work. My record was speaking at 6 in one day, with several a week common. Getting the tone and content right is of paramount importance, and claiming that we are best in the world is not it. World best is often claimed in this House. We don't always believe it, even if we want to. But I've also heard it in Brussels, from ministers and officials in multinational settings, listening in horror as it jeopardized relationships and carefully crafted compromises. I'm glad UKREP is getting bigger. I query whether it's enough and hope that those appointed are recognised, not passed over, when returning to London. Coordination with industry is also welcome. We don't have the government and industry solidarity on policy that some countries display. I doubt we ever will. But collective strategic activity is very effective. Others have long done it, and at a larger scale. Finally, one effectiveness factor that should not be underestimated is transparency to Parliament and the public. There is nothing as persuasive to any argument as their endorsements genuinely obtained.
Baroness Bennett of Manor Castle.
Many noble lords have referred to the fact that the subtitle of this report about it winning friends and influencing people. How the world looks at us, how it treats us, is important to our prosperity and our well-being. The opinion of potential international students, of business people looking to do business with our companies in diplomacy. Now, the noble and learned Lord Kerr of Kinlochard said, "We're increasingly being seen as untrustworthy and our good faith is being called into question." That has global impacts. Now, if we look at studies about how we've been regarded around the world, two relevant recent ones are the Good Country Index and the Reputation Index. The Good Country Index is based on objective criteria of environmental impact and impacts on the well-being of people around the world. The Reputation Index is a large-scale panel of G8 citizens. Interestingly, we're about in the same on both of them, 15th and 13th. And if we think about what might have impacted on that, history, decades, even centuries, will have had an impact. The military adventurism in Iraq and Afghanistan, our hideous colonial history of abuse and exploitation will have echoed through the decades and centuries. In the current day, our international aid, the maintenance of our GDP level, stepping in to chair COP26, those will, I think it's reasonable to say, have had a positive impact. How we deal with the COVID-19 pandemic will also have an impact. So my question to the Minister is, would the Minister agree that how we handle the Brexit transition will affect the world's view of us for decades to come? There's already irritation that we're forcing our European neighbours to focus on the Brexit transition when we're seeing that when they'd rather put the resources, the time, the energy into dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, there's a real fear, growing fear of a crash out and the huge economic and social impacts of that. The noble Lord Kirkhope used the metaphor of water pent up behind a dam, and that might also be used for the amount of work related to Brexit stacking up in your lordship's house. But if we think about that metaphor, that Europe and the world has in the middle now of a giant earthquake of COVID-19. If we then inflict the flood of Brexit, crisis and chaos on them, they will not be thanking of us, and it will affect their view of us for decades, even centuries to come.
Viscount Trenchard.
My Lords, I'm grateful to the noble Lord Boswell for introducing this debate today, even if his committee's interesting report was published 14 months ago. Much has changed since then. We have a new Prime Minister who has successfully negotiated a new withdrawal agreement, and the country has left the EU, at last delivering on the decision of the British people and fulfilling the promise made by the government led by David Cameron. Nevertheless, Much of the report remains valid, and the committee has served your Lordship's House well. The report deals extensively with the need to deploy whatever influence we can on our erstwhile EU partners during the implementation period. It recognises that our direct influence on the framing of EU laws and regulations has diminished because we are no longer in the room with the EU institutions. Would my noble friend the Minister agree that the report perhaps should have recognised that this loss of influence at the EU level will be compensated for by the increase in influence at the global level, where we will, just as soon as the implementation period is over, be in the room in our own right as a sovereign independent nation? In many areas, rules and regulations are increasingly set at the global level, and we now have an opportunity to play our part in ensuring that the development of the global trading system continues to be based on rules-based, competitive free trade and mutual recognition of equivalence of regulatory outcomes. We can be a strong advocate for the adoption of proportionate regulation, which gives less weight to the precautionary principle and encourages innovation. In this endeavour, our natural allies will be the United States and Japan, as well as our Commonwealth partners, including Australia, New Zealand, Canada and Singapore, and the other members of the CPTPP, to which I trust the Minister will confirm we will seek early accession.
The Earl of Clancarty.
My Lords, if a week is a long time in politics, then 14 months must be an eon. From today's vantage point, this report feels almost optimistic. Between then and now, others, as Lady Kennedy of the Shores memorably phrased it in March, have captured the castle. If it is ironic that the best way to win friends and influence people is to have stayed in the EU, there is a double irony that even early last year it felt that we had a hope and a desire to maintain real contact with Europe. Sadly, much of the whole point of Brexit for Brexiteers is to sever many of those ties of communication and cooperation. We had another taste of what may come on Sunday evening when the Prime Minister talked inappropriately, I felt, of developing a world-beating system for COVID testing, when COVID is a prime example of how we need to cooperate as a continent and indeed as a world in discovering the best ways to beat the virus. The irony of that, of course, is that the UK's ability to be a major part of COVID research will be threatened if we lose access to Horizon Europe, Horizon 2020's successor. This excellent report correctly identifies EU and other European agencies as means of exerting influence, although the benefits of cooperation, friendship if you will, is really the key in scientific research, in education and culturally. Those of us who believe in such continuing cooperation do need to keep pressing the government on these matters. So I ask the government, are they still actively seeking that the UK will remain meaningful, i.e. participating members of the Horizon programme and Erasmus? It will be a tragedy if it is left only up to individuals and individual institutions to maintain such contacts as they can, without recourse to any of the facilitating structures that other European countries will continue to have.
Lord Howell of Guildford.
My Lords, I'm the first to acknowledge the excellent work of our EU committees and their reports under both my noble friend Lord Boswell and the noble Lord Earl-Knull. However, in the case of this report, and as we come to the end of this debate, of course not really a debate at all, it's a series of statements, I do have to register my profound disappointment. The strong commitment in the report to scrutiny during both the transformation period and the future is admirable, but my disappointment can be summed up in a single sentence. Neither the Joint Committee on Future EU Relations nor this report take any account whatsoever of the fast-changing events and trends the other side of the channel within the EU and its institutions, which are now going on. Everyone acknowledges that Brexit will profoundly reshape the EU, and many European leaders and thinkers accept that the EU needs fundamental reform, having been originally created in the pre-digital age. Many also see that these changes are going on fast anyway, regardless of whether officials in Brussels recognize them. Treating the EU as an unchanging monolith will take as a hierarchy, will take our future relations straight into a brick wall. My Lords, this is over and above, of course, the major effects on the EU of the current pandemic crisis, which themselves will have considerable long-term impact on the whole EU structure and the relations between member states and the central authorities. My Lords, these enormous forces of change in Europe long predate this crisis and will continue long after it has subsided. So my question to the Minister is when we are really going to address them.
Baroness Ludford.
My Lords, I also paid tribute to Lord Boswell's long and distinguished leadership. His committee made a very useful report a year ago, but the regrettable delay in us being able to debate its sensible proposals for governance, transparency, influence and scrutiny has meant that in the meantime the situation has been transformed for the worse. It has become more complex, more unpredictable and more dangerous. Just over 18 months ago, then Prime Minister Theresa May agreed with the EU a political declaration on the future relationship that envisaged an ambitious, broad, deep and flexible partnership across trade and economic cooperation, law enforcement and criminal justice, foreign policy, security and defence, and wider areas of cooperation. The October 2019 version agreed by Prime Minister Johnson in fact stated the same aim, apart from adding with a comprehensive and balanced free trade agreement at its core. But the broader objective was in fact still there, including the explicit reference to it being a possible association agreement. Yet somehow in the last 7 months, the objective of the Johnson government has shrunk to no more than a Canada-type free trade agreement, apparently shorn even of the breadth of economic cooperation, and with a series of individual agreements, as tweeted by Mr. David Frost, instead of the umbrella of a broad and flexible partnership and its accompanying governance arrangements. We look forward to these drafts being published in the same way that the EU published 2 months ago its 440-page draft text. But whereas the EU called its draft the new economic partnership, that very notion appears to have been eradicated from the thinking of the present government. They have resiled from what they sensibly signed up to just last October in preference for a messy set of 10, maybe more, separate agreements. This is at a huge cost. A month ago, the Office of Budget Responsibility said that a typical FTA would cost a potential 5.2% of GDP over 15 years. The cost of trade friction, restrictions on migration, and red tape. Higher trade barriers would cause imports and exports to be 15% lower after 10 years, and UK productivity, already not exactly stellar, would also be lower. Yet, as my noble friend Lord Purvis of Tweed pointed out, the government refuses to publish its own economic assessment of the Canada-style deal it wants with the EU, while it has done one on the claimed advantages of the EU trade deal it wants, a measly maximum 0.16% of GDP. Mr. Gove did tell the Commons Brexit Committee that he saw economic opportunities for people wishing to work as customs agents, filling in forms to allow trade with the EU. The private sector estimates a need for 50,000 of those. Well, that's one example of the government's idea of a silver lining, I suppose. What an extraordinary ambition it is for a government to embrace, to have less than before, to erect trade barriers where none had existed, and to create jobs only in the red tape industry, all in the name of sovereignty. Noble lords such as the Noble Lord Hannay have spoken in this debate about level playing field issues in the economic sphere, but I, like the Noble Lord Ricketts, want to dwell on those concerning justice and security. In last October's political declaration, it was agreed that the scale and scope of future security arrangements should achieve an appropriate balance between rights and obligations. The closer and deeper the partnership, the stronger the accompanying obligations. And it went on. It should reflect the commitments the UK is willing to make that respect the integrity of the Union's legal order, such as with regard to alignment of rules and the mechanisms for disputes and enforcement. It should also be underpinned by long-standing commitments to the fundamental rights of individuals, including continued adherence and giving effect to the ECHR and adequate protection of personal data. Elsewhere in the political declaration, it was said that in view of the importance of data flows and exchanges across the future relationship, the parties are committed to ensuring a high level of personal data protection to facilitate such flows between them. But the government now seems to want the flows and exchanges without the commitments. It has been reported that it is seeking full access to the Europol database and the Schengen information system. But in his evidence last week to our EU committee, Mr. Gove gave us one reason for resisting EU regulatory standards, that the UK could lose freedom of manoeuvre for data sharing across government departments to deal with COVID. That does not sound very promising in respect of securing an EU data adequacy decision. In the same session, Mr. Gove said rather peevishly perhaps, I think that everything could be agreed. It all depends on the EU. For example, it would be within the EU's gift to give us access to the Schengen information system, but it insists that we submit to the European Court of Justice's jurisdiction. Mr. Gove absolutely knows that the EU is an organisation based on comprehensive arrangements of law, rules and enforcement. Indeed, elsewhere in his evidence, he expressed satisfaction that equivalence in financial regulation is a rules-based rather than a discretion-based process, which means that the EU would not promiscuously and whimsically withdraw equivalence. Yet he expects the EU to abandon its legal and data rules and promiscuously use discretion to gift us access to SIS. This is not serious. It seems to be preparation for a later complaint that the EU is being beastly to us and denying us the opportunity to have our cake and eat it. All this while the present government and its supporters play fast and loose over whether the Human Rights Act or even our membership of the European Convention on Human Rights are safe in their hands. This is not the basis for a security and justice partnership. On citizens' rights, I was pleased to hear Mr. Gove say that the government would want to show flexibility and humanity to EU citizens who miss the June 2021 deadline for applying for settled status. Whereas if memory serves, Home Secretary Priti Patel said recently that after that date, they would be illegal residents. They would thus be subject to the hostile environment. Can the Noble Lord the Minister confirm that there will be flexibility and humanity, not least to those looked after EU children, the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of Durham, referred to? It was also notable that Mr. Gove last week told our EU committee that the moral and social case was strong to accept the plea most recently from Austrian Chancellor Sebastian Kurz for physical documentary proof of status. This is a plea that our committee has repeatedly made. Will the government, in fact, accept it? Several noble lords, including my noble friends Lord Bruce and Lord Oates, have in this debate expressed great disquiet at the government's lack of action to implement the Irish Protocol. I can only second that disquiet. Mr. Gove said last week that opposing an extension to transition was not a matter of ideology, but because it could mean that the UK would potentially be subject to EU laws and rules in a way that would not be in our interest in a range of areas. I have already referred to my fear that the government want to diverge from EU privacy law. Can the Minister give other examples of desired flexibility? Surely, in any case, the pragmatic, non-ideological thing to do is to recognise that capacity and bandwidth for Brexit have been so diminished by COVID that an extension is just a no-brainer. My Lords, we certainly need to try and keep a national parliament office in Brussels on the premises of the European Parliament and to seek a joint parliamentary committee with the latter. But I fear that our goals will fall foul of the lack of ambition for a real partnership with the EU that this Johnson government has. This government needs to show that winning friends and influencing people is indeed what it has in mind.
Baroness Hayter of Kentish Town.
My Lords, this was a far-sighted report. It was over a year ago, and whilst today's world feels quite different, we've left the EU and we see the virus impacting both on our economy and the talks, which were delayed and have then now become virtual. Nevertheless, the thrust of its analysis remains pertinent, despite the government having dropped its plans for an ambitious, broad, deep and flexible partnership and a move away from the October political declaration signed by the Prime Minister, of which we've heard today. Furthermore, of course, many of the 2019 report's actors have changed, so it's David Frost, and not a minister, who is at his Zoom conference today, negotiating the UK's diplomatic, security and trading future. My Lords, the pandemic reminds us how global our future is and how important international cooperation needs to be. The historian, the late Michael Howard, said that all difficult problems must be dealt with by partners and allies. Whilst in one of the most moving moments on VE Day, the German president, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, looking back 75 years to when Germany was so alone, he said, "For us Germans, never again meant never again alone. We want more, not less cooperation in the world." And as the noble Lord Boswell said, introducing the debate, this is no time to pull up the drawbridge. While social distancing is important, conscious political self-isolation will never be a long-term goal. The report that he chaired urged the government to engage with the remaining EU member states to seek to establish mechanisms for regular bilateral dialogue. Perhaps the Minister could tell us whether this has actually happened. Britain stands on the brink of the worst recession since 1709, with huge implications for the type of deal the government should be negotiating, perhaps a different trade deal than that envisaged a year ago, especially as the US, the potential market so identified by the Prime Minister, becomes ever more protectionist, as noted by the noble Lord Campbell. We want to hear that our approach to the future deal is pragmatic, jobs and economy oriented, taking account of the likely reduction in air transport to the US and other distant markets. Could the noble Lord the Minister reassure us on this? It doesn't need me to repeat that one of the thorniest issues of Brexit, how to keep the Irish border free of checkpoints after Britain leaves the single market, has not been resolved. And throughout the UK, it is the implementation as well as the content of the final deal that is alarming business, farmers, lawyers, accountants, and consumers. With our EU exit having been moved from March 2019 to January this year, since the report was written, the preparations for the agreed term is therefore shorter than the 2 years initially foreseen. The current deadline is not simply, in the government's words, June, before they start preparing for a no deal, but the 31st of December, when all the customs posts and tariffs must be in place, to say nothing of the paperwork. The government, we hear, training 50,000 form fillers via Mr. Gove's Custom Agent Academy. My Lords, the previous Secretary of State promised full and proper accountability to Parliament and said, and I quote, "Parliament rightly expects ministers will be fully accountable to Parliament in the exercise of their duties on the future relationship joint committee." However,
Since the Prime Minister took political control of the talks, he has shown precious little inclination to report back and has failed to share the government's drafts either with the Parliament as a whole or even with a limited confidential grouping of Parliament, or even, as the noble Lord Kerr reminded us, with the 27 member states. The Prime Minister has also failed to accord the devolved administrations their proper role, as my noble friends Lord Fuchs and Morris said. Despite a written answer I received from the Minister yesterday, committing the government to working closely with the devolved administrations throughout negotiations to secure a future relationship that works in the interest of the whole of the UK, I'm told that engagement with the devolved administrations has been superficial and tokenistic. They've not had sights of the legal texts and had no opportunity to feed in meaningfully to the negotiating positions, even on issues which will fall to them to implement. Jeremy Miles, for the Welsh Government, called the engagement deficient. And whilst a meeting of the Joint Ministerial Committee on EU negotiations will take place later this month, it'll be the first such meeting since January. This at a time of supposed intense negotiations. Gibraltar also raises big issues at this stage of the negotiations. It already faced having to make seismic change and costly adaptations with only a very short transition period. But this is now compounded by the huge impact of COVID-19. It will be critical for Gibraltar to have some sort of cushion or breathing space, given it's having to borrow vast sums to handle the crisis. Indeed, should the 14-day guarantee cover Gibraltar, so they have to be quarantines, unlike Ireland, there could be added tensions with Spain, or indeed about the future deal. In addition to Parliament's role vis-à-vis government, is the call by the new chair of the EU Committee, Lord Knoll, for a structured interparliamentary dialogue as part of the future relationship. We look forward to the Minister's response as to how the government and Parliament can work to establish such an interparliamentary body. My Lords, we hear the talks are not making good progress, with substantial differences between the two sides, on the level playing field, fishing and much else, and with EU officials wary of British efforts to make rapid headway on securing a trade agreement, retaining access to aviation market and other core UK concerns, whilst leaving fishing and other issues in the slow lane. The government seems yet again to be scaling back their ambition for a UK-EU trade deal. First, we were promised the exact same benefits as EU membership, then Canada plus, and now Michael Gove has confirmed that the aim is any deal which gives them the power to reduce employment and environment standards. This approach puts ideology before jobs and our economy, as well as straining our ability to secure a good deal by December. A deal with tariffs on some goods would be significantly more complex to negotiate than the status quo of zero tariffs and zero quotas, and raises serious issues for the Northern Ireland Protocol. Could the noble Lord the Minister therefore assure the House that, whatever it takes, our exit from the transition will be on terms that benefit our whole economy, our security, and vitally, our future relationship with the EU and its member states?
Minister Lord True. I've got to unmute.
Yes, somebody's not. I need to be am I unmuted now?
You are now. You are now. Yes.
Yes. Sorry, I just I unmuted because I was muted, and then somebody muted me, I think. Anyway, I'll get on so it doesn't waste time after this very important debate. And of course, my lords, the first thing that I would want to do is to express my gratitude and indeed admiration for and admiration of my noble friend, Lord Boswell, not only for his report, of his long service to his country and his very distinguished chairmanship of the EU committee. And of course, I look forward to working closely with his successor, the Noble Earl, Lord Kinnoul, who's proving himself already to be a doughty and statesman-like leader in that role. The report is a crucially important one in its title, Beyond Brexit: How to Win Friends and Influence People. And my lords, the noble the Duke of Montrose reminded us of, from the past perspective, of the importance, obviously, of international friendship and cooperation. Friendships and cooperation which can lie across, within and outside all sorts of international institutions. And I simply disagree with the view of those who say that the government is, I've heard the terms in this debate, isolationist, dogmatic. I won't list them, my lords, but it's simply not a fair representation of the attitude of this government, or indeed of the British people, who I must remind this House did vote for a new relationship between this country and the European Union, and ipso facto a new relationship between this country and the wider world. And there were times in this debate, my lords, when I felt like whistling to myself or humming "Lead Kindly Light" amidst the encircling gloom, because many of the speeches shared a tone of impossibilism and doubt that this country could succeed in its objectives and could succeed in its common objectives, which are to reach a friendly and future relationship with our friends in the European Union. And my lords, the view of the government is that there is ample time to strike a deal based on fair trade and friendly cooperation. And as your lordships know, we are largely looking for an agreement that like those that the EU has agreed with others. So there are plenty of precedents and texts around. We're both familiar with each other's systems, and with sufficient energy, my lords, there is plenty of time. Moreover, the EU agreed to this timeline when it agreed the political declaration last autumn. No one, I submit, should be casting doubt on it. We should be getting on with it. Now, my lords, of course, COVID, as a number of noble lords have referred to, exists, a great tragedy and a great crisis. But my lords, the government has the bandwidth and has the capacity to conduct negotiations within Europe and to deal with the COVID crisis, as my right honourable friend, Mr. Gove, assured the EU committee last week. And the view of the government remains, notwithstanding the succession of noble lords who asked for an extension in the transition, the government's view remains that extending the transition would simply prolong the negotiations, prolong business uncertainty, and delay the moment of control of our borders. Extending the transition, as noble Lord Cavendish of Furness said, would mean we would have to make further payments into the EU budget. It would also keep us bound by EU legislation at a point when we need legislative and economic flexibility to manage the UK response to the COVID pandemic. My lords, some would characterise that as an ideological statement. My lords, I would characterise it as a statement of a government that's intent on doing what has been asked to do by the British people, and to do so in an amicable way to reach agreement with the people who will always remain our European friends. Now, some have said that a long time has elapsed since this report was published, and I was reminded when the noble Lord Clancarty was speaking of the old saying that there are decades where nothing happens, and there are many weeks when decades happen. Sometimes in this House last year, it seemed that there were hours when weeks happened, my lords. But new circumstances have arisen, and we are now finally beyond Brexit. Having left the EU in January, and with a third round of the negotiations on our future relationship having started yesterday, and with, I repeat, the transition period ending at the end of the year. And whilst the passage of time has clearly has meant that many areas raised in this report have been superseded, I do agree with many noble lords who've spoken that it doesn't make the debate any less important, or our aspiration for good relations within Europe, across Europe and beyond, vitally important. And I hope to respond a little later to some of the specific points on our representation. And I'd also acknowledge the very important remarks made by my noble friend, Lord Howell of Guildford. While much of the work of this House and the other place has lately been focused on what we were looking to achieve, actually this report and debate was about not losing sight of the question of how we should achieve our objectives. And I will try to address most of that in the rest of my remarks. But I would like to answer one or two specific points that were raised in the debate on financial equivalence, financial services equivalence. My lords, we do still believe that it would be possible to reach an understanding on that by June. And on the question raised by the noble, the Right Reverend Prelate, sorry, it's without the technology lets me down. So I'll come back to the question about refugee children. We hope we're able to assure the Right Reverend Prelate, Bishop of Durham, later in this my response. Many noble lords asked about the work of the Withdrawal Agreement Joint Committee and the specialised committees. Now, the Joint Committee met for the first time on the 30th of March via remote means and was co-chaired, as you know, by my right honourable friend, the Chancellor of the Duchy, and the European Commission Vice President, Maros Šefčovič. The UK and EU updated the Joint Committee on progress to implement the withdrawal agreement, with particular focus on citizens' rights, which I agree with the noble Baroness Ludford are important, and I endorse what my noble friend, my right honourable friend, said on that matter, and on the Northern Ireland Protocol, which I'll come to in a moment. The UK and EU also agreed to start the work of the 6 specialised committees on citizens' rights, other separation provisions, Protocol on Ireland, Northern Ireland, the Protocol relating to the sovereign base areas on Cyprus, the Protocol on Gibraltar, and financial provisions. And the UK and EU co-chairs of the specialised committees have each now spoken informally. They're making plans for their respective specialised committees to meet as appropriate. And indeed, the Northern Ireland Protocol Specialised Committee met on the 30th of April. UK and EU officials co-chaired the first meeting via video, and the UK and EU co-chairs both welcomed actually the collaborative and constructive conversation. The government's determined to give Parliament appropriate opportunity for scrutiny of the Withdrawal Agreement Joint Committee, and we have committed to issuing written ministerial statements before and after each meeting. The government's always been clear, and the noble Lord Wood and actually noble Baroness Hayter referred to Gibraltar. The government's always been clear that Gibraltar is covered by our negotiations with the EU, and we have committed to involve them fully. And decisions on representation at specialised committee meetings will be taken in accordance with the withdrawal agreement. Now, on the Northern Ireland Protocol, my lords, a number of noble lords asked about work on Northern Ireland. If I listed the names on each occasion, it would take time from this debate. The noble Lord Kane, however, did take a slightly different view, or introduced a parallel point, reminding us that our top priority in implementing the Northern Ireland Protocol should be to protect the Good Friday Agreement and gains from the peace process, and to preserve Northern Ireland's place in the United Kingdom. That is the central purpose of this government in agreeing ways to carry this forward. The protocol, my lords, puts legal obligations on both sides. We are committed to complying with ours, just as we expect the EU to comply with theirs. Now, I was asked, and I apologise to the noble Baroness Ritchie for not replying on this in the previous debate. I was asked about the EU Office Commission presence in Belfast. My lords, there's actually no reason why the Commission should require a permanent presence in Belfast to monitor the implementation of the protocol, nor any reason with respect to the noble Lord Kerr of Kinlochard why that should cause distrust. This is not a requirement that was included within the protocol. It's an additional EU ask. And Article 12 of the Northern Ireland Protocol doesn't necessitate or place any requirement on the UK to facilitate such a presence. Our position remains that EU officials can exercise their rights under Article 12 of the Protocol without necessarily a permanent presence in Northern Ireland. The protocol, my lords, is a practical solution to prevent a hard border on the island of Ireland and makes clear, and this is important, that Northern Ireland is and will remain part of the customs territory of the United Kingdom. The arrangements that we introduce will reflect this. As set out in the New Decade New Approach deal, the government has committed to legislate to guarantee unfettered access for Northern Ireland's businesses to the whole of the UK internal market and ensure that this legislation is in force for January 2021. And we want to work with Northern Ireland businesses, as many noble lords have asked us to ensure new administration procedures are streamlined and do not affect the flow of trade. The protocol also ensures that the future arrangements for Northern Ireland will be dependent on the consent of those affected by it through a vote that can take place every 4 years. We will continue to take forward discussions on the implementation of the protocol in the Joint Committee and Specialised Committee, and do so in good faith. Now, my lords, a number of noble lords remarked on how we're engaging with the EU during the transition period. Since the UK has left the European Union, we are seeking to engage and cooperate with the EU through normal diplomatic channels. And that is why the EU will not attend, the UK will not attend EU meetings other than in exceptional circumstances. Our relationship with the EU and its member states will be conducted on the basis of normal diplomatic and international practice as part of our wider agenda. But, my lords, as the noble Baroness Bowles, I think it was, that recognised, it is the fact that the United Kingdom government is increasing the work of the number of members of the UCMIS, formerly known as UCREP for those who are not up with changes, the UK mission to the EU. That will continue to be our principal interface with EU institutions. And as part of our strengthening, and I agree with the noble Lord MP of the importance of this, a part of the strengthening of our diplomatic effort and our effort across Europe, UCMIS Brussels has grown from over 120 staff in 2016 to over 180 staff at the time of the UK's exit from the EU. And it has established a dedicated public diplomacy function to support the new ways of working, and has also enhanced, my lords, its communications team, which will play an important role in shaping the narrative around the UK's activities and priorities within Europe. We do set great importance, my lords, and great store by the importance of maintaining good relations across Europe with our European partners. We also, the noble Lord Fowkes and the noble Lord McConnell are among many who raised the question of the devolved administrations. Of course, the UK government is engaged with the devolved administrations during the development of the approach to negotiations through regular official meetings and bilateral discussions, my lords, between the Paymaster General and her ministerial counterparts in DAs. That has ensured that the UK government has taken on board views of the DAs, and that's been reflected in the published approach to negotiations. And I can reaffirm our commitment to working with them to deliver a future relationship with the EU that works for the whole UK. Other than the UK government is committed to this, and the Paymaster General spoke to ministers from the DAs to update them on the negotiations and exchange views last week on the 6th of May. I follow my right honourable friend, Mr. Michael Gove, in responding to the important question raised by the Noble Earl Lord Kinnoul and a number of other peers who spoke about parliamentary engagement with the EU institutions post-Brexit. It's clear that, and quite understandably, that many members of your Lordship's House are keen to maintain those links. They're important links between the parliaments of member states. But I repeat the position that expressed by my right honourable friend when he spoke to your Lordship's EU committee, that it is really not for the government to tell Parliament how to maintain and develop these arrangements, but I can assure the Noble Earl that the government is certainly keen and supportive of such proposals and such developments. I was asked about participation in EU agencies, my lords, by the Noble Lord Lord Bruce, the Noble Lord Brewers and others. We will, of course, discuss with the EU how best to manage our friendly relations, but any solution does have to respect our red line of no communications to follow, no commitments to follow EU law, and no acceptance of the CJ-EU. That is fundamental and was something that was put to the British people at the last election. Now, unfortunately, there are relatively limited options for third country membership of EU bodies. We've been clear that we'll be operating on the basis of existing precedents where they represent a real benefit to the British people and industry, and also provide convincing value for money. And I can confirm that we are considering participation, yes, in Horizon and in a number of other organisations, a number of other bodies which were referred to in the debate. And we're also considering, obviously, participation in Erasmus+. My lords, coming back to my noble friend, Lord Duncan of Springbank asked about climate change. We're already working closely with the EU on climate change, and I see no reason why that shouldn't continue. And I'd also want to confirm that the UK will continue its participation in the emission trading scheme during the transition period. My lords, on refugee children, I can now, the technology having worked, reply to the Right Reverend Prelate. The UK continues to be fully committed to meeting our obligations under the Dublin regulation. We remain in close contact with member states in order to keep abreast of updates and establish where transfers can take place as quickly and safely as possible, and in accordance with existing COVID-19 restrictions. So I hope that that is a reasonable response. My lords, have been so, the Noble Lord, Lord Moynihan referred to the importance of sport. That, of course, is important within Europe, both in the UK, in the EU and outside the EU, and one recognises that. My lords, unfortunately, time is constrained, and I agree with the feelings of a number of those noble lords have spoken. It'll be a good day when we can get back to challenge and response. But the debate, despite my feelings sometimes that it was a little pessimistic, has been a good one and an instructive one. And of course, it's demonstrated, again, the capacity of this House and its committees to look at the issue of our exit from the EU in the round and look towards our long-term relationship. That, my lords, is we do not believe that our vision for the future is incompatible with having a close relationship with the EU. We continue to see the EU as our neighbour and our friend, and the EU nations as our neighbours and our friends. And we will continue to aspire to and to have a relationship inspired by our shared history and values, and I hope always informed by your Lordship's House.
I call Lord Boswell of Ainhoe.
My Lords, briefly and in conclusion, may I begin by thanking all noble lords for their contributions and, if I may say, for their personal kindness towards me. And may I also thank the Minister for his efforts to respond to the debate within the constraints of time. All I would say to him and to other members of the government in present circumstances is don't close your mind. Remember that there is no stigma in being flexible and pragmatic in order to meet the interests of the country. And I'll leave it perhaps at that. It has been, and through the debate it has been the case, that the complex EU structures, including their legal structures, and the protracted nature of the Brexit debates we've had over the last 4 years have been about, or have been centred on, detailed issues. And of course our report, as we have mentioned, went into some of those detailed implementation issues. Yet beyond that, I think the current exceptional circumstances drive us to some reappraisal of our strategic priorities. I noted with approval an article in the Times recently by the former Prime Minister Theresa May, commenting simply and powerfully, strong international relations are vital to our security and success. I hope we can all agree on that. I'm proud in this case of the EU Committee's role in taking our strategic thinking beyond Brexit. The answer for this country lies not into some retreat into what I might call national lockdown, but it must lie in attention and commitment to continuing international engagement. As the debate has made clear, we have all the circumstances of the pandemic, we have issues of climate change. We could perhaps have said more about their interaction in the position of developing countries and its ongoing impact, for example, on migration. There is a huge international agenda out there to which we must not turn our back. As we reflect this week on the lessons of the Second World War, which indeed led to the foundation of what became the European Union, we must leave ourselves space to rise to the occasion, and in doing so with other partners across the world, perhaps play our proper part in making the world a better place. My Lords, I beg to move.
My Lords, the question is that this motion be agreed to. As many as of that opinion will say content, the contrary not content, the contents have it. The virtual proceedings on this motion are now complete. My Lords, the virtual proceedings will now adjourn until a convenient point after 7:15 for the statement, when the chair of these proceedings will be Baroness Heddick. Thank you.
My Lords, the virtual proceedings on the statement made in the House of Commons yesterday on the COVID-19 strategy will now commence. Please note that it has been agreed in the usual channels to dispense with the reading of the statement itself, and we will proceed immediately to questions from the opposition front bench. I should say that when we come to backbench questions, Lord Rogan will take the chair. So I now call Baroness Smith of Basildon.
My Lords, having watched the Prime Minister's recorded message on Sunday and his statement to MPs yesterday, I want to make two observations. Firstly, that we recognise that the complexities and unknowns of this virus mean that decisions about how we respond are very difficult and they're very challenging. And to meet those unprecedented challenges, the government must provide certainty, confidence and clarity. Unfortunately, in his two statements, the Prime Minister missed those targets by announcing the plans without the detail that was needed. So Dominic Raab had to then tour the media studios on Monday morning with the basic message of what the Prime Minister meant to say was, for example, when Mr Johnson said people who are able to go back to work on Monday, he really meant Wednesday. So when we most needed clarity, we got confusion. We now have the strategy documents so we can discuss the detail, but I say to the noble lady, there's a reason that statements should be made to Parliament rather than taking the Boo Peter approach of here's one I made earlier and recorded especially for the media. The government should not see the normal process of consultation, engagement, questions and scrutiny as political obstacles to be avoided. It must understand this is the way in which we get the best decisions and therefore the best outcomes. And it's only by highlighting problems that we can work together to overcome them. So can the noble lady confirm that the impact assessments on these strategy documents will also be published? Because of the way in which this has been handled, there are, I think, numerous questions to be addressed to ensure the public has all the information they need and that we can all monitor and support the way forward. Can I ask the noble lady to confirm that she will guarantee that no question today is left unanswered? And if necessary, she will follow up in writing with complete answers. So I want to pick up just 4 specific issues. Firstly, it's about understanding the R rate, the reproduction rate, and that it is essential in fighting the virus. Can I ask her how robust is the calculation of the current level being between 0.5 and 0.9? The report states there are currently 136,000 people infected in the UK. Given that there's no universal testing or tracing, on what scientific basis is it calculated? And what is the confidence level of the statistics and the margin of error? So it's a basic question of whether it's a calculation or an estimate. Our national strategy is predicated on that figure, so we need to be able to respond quickly if it changes, either by further easing restrictions or, as is happening in parts of Germany and in South Korea, having to respond to an increase in the R rate. So how quickly can we accurately identify changes and adapt plans accordingly? And if we're asking that those that enter the country self-isolate for 14 days to help keep the R rates down, how is this going to be enforced and monitored? Secondly, the Prime Minister said that the virus varies across the nations and regions of the UK and therefore needs a flexible response. Now, I think that makes sense. But flexibility doesn't mean the government going it alone for England. It means consultation and engagement to ensure coherent policy, even if there are differences. So what discussion and consultation took place with the devolved governments before the Prime Minister's announcement? And I have to ask her, is it really true that they heard about the change of advice from stay at home to stay alert in the media and on Twitter? The noble lady attends COBRA meetings, so she will be aware of the weekly meetings with the leaders of devolved administrations. Can I ask her whether these differences in policy were discussed at those meetings? And can she also confirm they will continue to be weekly, which I think it seems even more important now that they are, but if not, why not? Also, on a smaller regional level, how accurate is that R figure in identifying regional and local differences? We see that the information regarding infections and deaths are given at local government level. Can the R rate be identified in the same way? I also want to ask us something about the advice on going back to work, because it still appears to be that if you can work from home, you should do so. And many decisions will be predicated on social distancing and other protection measures that are in place. Now, I've got real concerns about workplaces where there's no proper system for challenging decisions that are taken by an employer or manager. Should employees have little or no confidence that a proper risk assessment of the workplace is being carried out or acted upon, what support will the government provide to protect their health and indeed any threat of job losses just for asking questions? And I have to put this to the noble lady as well. Does she consider that the Health and Safety Executive is fit for purpose on this front? Does it have both the capacity and the political support? We've today had more detail on how social distancing will work on public transport and where capacity is to be dramatically reduced. But given that demand to travel on buses, trams, trains and the tube may start to outstrip supply, how will the government ensure that transport networks are not overwhelmed by those just trying to get back to work, as the government has advised? It's also suggested that primary schools will go back in June. In the interest of the wider workforce, is guidance being prepared for schools and nurseries on how long children should attend for each day? Because if that's provided, it could help the public, employers and employees properly plan ahead. And on all those issues, can she confirm that genuine consultation with the relevant trade unions will be part of the decision-making and implementation process? Just a final point, my lords, as we move to the next stages and some parts of everyday life begin to reopen, it's even more important that we get shielding and support for vulnerable people right. What is the government doing to improve their efforts to identify and notify those in high-risk categories? Local authorities are reporting huge errors, have initially raised their concerns as the numbers seem too low, and they were not being asked to contribute their knowledge as identification was being undertaken centrally. It now appears that thousands of people have been initially missed off. And in some areas, local authorities are being told that the numbers of citizens to be shielded have more than doubled in the last week. And I think that's a lesson to us all, that local authorities have a vital role to play, given their understanding and knowledge of their communities. And that ongoing, we have to work in partnership to improve that and harness their local knowledge. And finally, my lords, a huge amount is being asked of individuals over the coming weeks. People will rise to the challenge and do their best to keep themselves and each other safe. But it's not just an individual responsibility, but a collective one. And the government must maintain its end of the bargain. That means delivering on testing, on tracing, and PPE for frontline workers. Over the past few months, our lives have changed. Thousands are grieving for loved ones. We've seen extraordinary efforts and commitment to manage and eradicate the virus and to support individuals and communities. Staff in the NHS, in caring, in transport, in retail, in pharmacies, and so many other public-facing roles that we rely on have done so much. We have a responsibility to them, and we have a responsibility to prepare for the future, to do what we can to get the economy moving, supporting people getting back to work, but with great caution, as well as hope for what our country might become when this horrible disease is no more.
Lord Newby.
My Lords, can I begin by thanking the noble leader, the leader of the House, for taking questions on the Prime Minister's statement. I think everybody agrees that the government has to strike an extraordinarily difficult balance in moving from the simplicity of lockdown and the stay-at-home slogan towards some sort of social and economic normality without jeopardizing the progress being made to control the virus. And that even whilst following the science, there are many uncertainties and risks which have to be weighed and where decisions have to be based on judgments which only ministers can make. In these circumstances, the best way to secure maximum public trust and support is to be clear, to be consistent, and to be open. The Prime Minister's statements, both to the nation and the Commons, coupled with many and various briefings by ministers, SPADs and other officials over the past week, have unfortunately led to many uncertainties, inconsistencies and unanswered questions. So I'd like to ask the noble lady, the Leader of the House, first, on testing, how resilient does the government believe the system now is? Given that only a few days ago, it sent some 5,000 tests to America because they couldn't be analysed in a timely manner in the UK. And have any further such shipments proved necessary? On the crucial track and trace technology, how confident is the government that its own bespoke system, currently being tested in the Isle of Wight, is fit for purpose, in the light of its placing of a 3.8 million contract last week to investigate the use in the UK of a completely different system? If a track and trace system is implemented, how will the government ensure that those who need to isolate will do so, given that the number of people it plans to employ on this task is way short of the numbers involved in those countries which have been following such a system effectively for some time? And will it consider establishing multidisciplinary community COVID teams on the German model, involving local directors of public health, which will not only check that people really are isolating themselves, but they're getting the support they need in their homes? Underlying these questions, my lords, is the common theme of a monolithic national programme which has been implemented with little apparent understanding of local conditions and the potential for working collaboratively with local public and private sector partners. Will the government now look at developing a more collaborative approach in the months ahead to avoid some of the problems that it's encountered in the weeks we've just seen? Moving on to the safety of people at work, an issue which the noble Baroness Lady Smith touched on. Compliance with the rules is policed by the Health and Safety Executive and local authorities. Both are desperately short of resources to undertake this additional work. So what further resources will the government now make available to them to ensure that if employees do have concerns about their working conditions, they can get a timely inspection of their premises? My lords, at the moment, I fear that any concerns raised by employees are not going to be dealt with expeditiously because there simply aren't the people who are able to deal with them. My lords, in relation to quarantining for those coming into the UK, why has the government waited so long to take a measure which has been in place in over 100 other countries for several months? And if this is now such an important barrier against the virus, why has the Prime Minister agreed to President Macron's request to exempt all those travelling from France, which has also had a very high incidence of the disease? It's very difficult to see on what science that particular decision could possibly have been made. On schools, my lords, why have reception and year one groups been prioritised over other primary and junior years, given that these groups are going to find it the most difficult to maintain social distancing? Again, what's the scientific rationale for that? And in the light of the fact that some headmasters are saying that they will not open their schools because they don't believe they can do so safely, what response, if any, does the government plan in such cases? And finally, in relation to your Lordship's House, the Prime Minister has been very keen to urge the House of Commons to, in his words, move towards further physical proceedings in step with public health guidance in the House of Commons. Does the noble lady agree that the Lords should also be embracing this principle and moving now towards a hybrid chamber on the lines of that already in place in the Commons? My Lords, as the noble Baroness Lady Smith has already said, there's been a terrific communal response, positive response to beating this virus. That feeling exists strongly today, but if it's to continue, the government must just be open with the people, be clear, and make sure that all of us know how we're supposed to behave in the best interests of ourselves, our families, and the country in the months ahead.
Lord Privy Seal, Baroness Evans of Bowes Park.
Well, I'd like to thank the Noble Lord and the Noble Baroness for their comments. And like them, I pay tribute to everybody for the fantastic national effort that we have seen over the last few weeks. The Noble Lady and the Noble Lord are absolutely right. It is critical that we provide information at this very difficult time, and particularly as we're coming out of the lockdown that we've seen. And we are committed to keeping Parliament and the public informed. In addition to the plan that was published on Monday, over 45 guidance documents have now been published, and there is more to come. So we are absolutely committed to making sure that everybody has the up-to-date and best information that they can have in order that they can understand their responsibilities and the decisions they have to make in the coming weeks. The Noble Baroness asked about the vulnerable and shielded, and I can assure her that there has been a huge amount of cross-government, cross-agency work and local government work. Local Resilience Forum in particular are playing a critical role in supporting and helping those who are shielded. That will continue. And of course, we should also pay tribute to the hundreds of thousands of members of the public who've signed up to the Good Samaritan app in order to help and provide support to these people. The Noble Lady rightly asked about the data, and she asked about the R rate. And the fact that the R rate today remains between 0.5 and 0.9, it still remains perilously close to 1. That is the reason that we are taking very careful steps in the coming weeks. And in particular, that is why we have set up the Joint Biosecurity Centre, which will bring together the UK's leading epidemiological expertise to ensure that future outbreaks are detected and brought under control. This centre will collect a range of data to build up a picture of infection rates across the country, analyse the data to form pictures of changes in infection rates across the country, so providing intelligence on both the overall national picture and potential community level spikes. We'll advise the CMO of a potential change of the alert level, which we've also just set up, who would then advise ministers. It will identify specific actions to address local spikes in infection in partnership with local agencies. And of course, it will work in partnership with the government and the devolved administrations to ensure it is effective throughout the United Kingdom. So I hope through that, the Noble Baroness will see that this centre is going to be critical as we move into the next phase, and will rightly be looking at all the data, its robustness, and ensuring that we can act quickly to changes in data, and along with SAGE, advise the government. And several other countries, such as New Zealand, South Korea, and the United States, are also operating a COVID alerted system of the type that we have just set up. I can assure the Noble Lady that the devolved administrations have indeed been involved in all discussions. As she rightly says, I sit on a number of the COBRA committees, and at every committee, representatives of the devolved administrations attend. We discuss areas of best practice, of mutual interest, and indeed where approaches and data slightly diverge. So I believe it has been a very strong relationship between the administrations, but there have been differences in the data in each country, and it is of course right that the devolved administrations make decisions for the people of their areas. Both the Noble Lord and the Noble Lady asked about the return to work. We have been working closely with unions, the Health and Safety Executive, public health authorities, business groups and local authorities to develop the guidance that we've published for businesses, and we will of course continue to do so. I'm pleased to let the Noble Lord and Noble Baroness know that today we announced a further £14 million of additional funding for the Health and Safety Executive. We are determined that they're able to do their job. Nobody should be forced to work in an unsafe workplace. And if employees are concerned that their employers aren't taking all practical steps to promote social distancing, they can report them to the local authority or to the HSE, who can take a range of action, and we will support them in doing that. The Noble Lady and Noble Lord asked about schools. We want to get reception in Year 1 children back into education as quickly as possible, as the scientific advice allows, because we believe it's the best place for them to learn. And we know it's important for their mental well-being to be back with their friends and teachers. Schools will only open in a phased way and only when it is safe to do so. And we will, of course, continue to work closely with the unions on this. We have published guidance for schools and other healthcare settings. We're asking them to implement a range of protective measures, including increasing cleaning, reducing pinch points at the start and end of the day, and utilising outdoor space. And we will be looking at them staying in their small classes for as long as possible so they have minimum contact with groups around the rest of the school. The Noble Lord asked about testing, and we do believe that we have a robust system in place, but we will not be complacent. We're trialling the NHS app, but that is just one part of the track and tracing system that we will be using. So we will ensure that the vulnerable and those who do not have access to the app will be able to be track and traced. And we will certainly continue to learn from international experience, as the Noble Lord mentioned. The Noble Lord also asked about UK borders. During the contain phase, we had enhanced monitoring at the borders to identify symptomatic travellers, but once there was significant transmission within the UK, the scientific advice was that border restrictions would have had a marginal effect on the number of coronavirus cases. But now that domestic transmission within the UK is coming under control, it is right that we take these new measures. And as the Noble Lord said, the Prime Minister has been talking to President Macron in order to develop a joint approach. Just finally, the Noble Lord asked about the House of Lords and a hybrid house. As he will know, work is ongoing at the moment to work out how we can do it, but I'm sure all Noble Lords will want to ensure that we return, if we return in a physical way, we do so in a safe environment, both for your lordships, but also for the staff who are supporting us fantastically through this difficult time.
We now come to the 30 minutes allocated for backbench questions. Lord Flight.
My Lords, I would first thank and congratulate all who've been involved in containing the coronavirus crisis. The government plans are correctly conditional, and the government has a difficult balance to strike. This must avoid proceeding too far and too fast. When life is at stake, perhaps the first objective must be to avoid a second peak, which could overwhelm the NHS. Under the government's plan, we are now close to or just about in level 3. My question is, when is our target 1 to being in level 1? When does it expect to be achieved? Secondly, and prompted by my wife, I focus on the tragic number of the elderly and vulnerable who have died in care homes and where the COVID virus is still life-threatening. Would the government consider obliging all care home employers to provide regular testing of the carers in their employment? Many carers do not wish to be tested as they fear they would lose their jobs if found positive.
I thank the Noble Lord for his question. First of all, over 140,000 tests have been delivered to almost 440 care homes since April. The CQC have referred over 34,000 care workers for testing, so testing is on the up, and we will be delivering up to 30,000 tests a day for staff and residents of all care homes that look after the over 65s by early June. I'm afraid the Noble Lord can't tempt me to make us to speculate about when we might reach level 1. Of course, that is what we are aiming for, but we have set out some cautious steps over the next couple of months that we believe we can take, but only, as he rightly says, if we manage to keep the virus under control and we all pay attention to the social distancing and the other measures that will need to keep us safe.
Baroness Purnell.
My Lords, I refer the House to interests as declared. I want to return to this question of safety in the workplace. would the noble lady not agree that in order to provide clarity and simplicity, the government should agree now to make COVID-19 safety standards in the workplace legally enforceable, thus ensuring that employers who implement the safety standards are not undercut by employers who do not, and employees, importantly, have a quick resolution of disputes about safety of their workplace, and they have confidence that their health and well-being is protected without delay so that they can continue to be in their workplace safely.
Well, I hope as I answered in the previous question, it is absolutely right that nobody should be forced to work in an unsafe workplace. And I set out a number of ways in which employees who did have concerns could take forward those concerns. Of course, we expect businesses to abide by the COVID secure guidelines. We've done a whole series of them for different types of workplaces. And we've been working very closely with the unions, with health and safety executive, with public health authorities to make sure that these are accessible, and we will be working very hard with businesses to make sure that they provide the safe workplaces that we all want to see.
Lord Taylor of Goldsmoor.
My Lords, the muddled messages of the last 72 hours have left the nation uncertain and confused by the Prime Minister's plan. Does the Minister agree that first publishing draft proposals, even options, kind of green paper, which experts, Parliament and the public could have scrutinised and interrogated, could have delivered greater clarity, less confusion, and quite possibly better answers? Then announcing conclusions first to Parliament, where they could be questioned and explained, would certainly have ensured the all too obvious confusions were at least answered and hopefully avoided. Does the Minister agree Parliament has evolved in this way for a reason? Frankly, I'm one of those who believes that the NHS has increased capacity and the number of new cases is down, means a more targeted strategy focused on protecting the vulnerable would have been the better next step. Can the government at least now publish its assessment of the main options that have been canvassed?
As I mentioned, I believe that we are being clear in our messaging, and I think our messages to the public, they do understand. As I said, in addition to the roadmap, we have published over 46 pieces of additional guidance on a whole range of areas, from transport to workplace safety to school settings, and we will continue to do that over the coming weeks. We want to keep into a dialogue with both Parliament and the public as we take everyone with us as we navigate this cruel disease. And I believe everyone is playing their part. It's fantastic that we've been able to get to a point where we have a roadmap where we can start to see a bit of light at the end of the tunnel, albeit one that we have to make sure we continue abiding by the social distancing rules, making sure we keep up with hand washing and all those other things that we've been told about. That's what we need to do in order to keep moving in the right direction as we tackle this disease.
The Earl of Clongarty.
My Lords, how confident is the government in reaching and maintaining the 200,000 a day testing target from the end of this month, which the Prime Minister promised yesterday in answer to a question during the statement?
Well, we're not complacent at all about the task ahead of us, but we did reach the 100,000 tests when we said we would. Our testing capacity was 110,670, and in the last 24 hours up to the 12th of May, 85,293 tests were undertaken. This is a massive effort, and huge amounts of credit should go to everybody who is ramping it up, and we will continue to work to the target the Prime Minister has set.
The Lord Bishop of Durham.
My Lords, language matters. Loose language and sloppy images hinder rather than help. We need to continue to suppress the coronavirus, learn to coexist with it, as eradication is a long way off. Does the Minister agree that any recovery roadmap must recognise and speak of the importance of spiritual, social and mental well-being as much as physical and economic health? So as phase 2 and 3 are developed, will the noble lady guarantee that this will be the case?
Well, I thank the Right Reverend Prelate for his comments, and he's absolutely right. And I can assure him that mental health, well-being, physical, mental, as well as obviously the financial pressures that many people are facing are foremost in our minds. But as he rightly says, what is absolutely critical is that having got the disease under control and being able to move steps forward, we have to make sure we continue with that. And if we do start to see the R rate rise again, we have to take swift action to make sure that we don't see a second peak.
The Lord Mackenzie of Welgate.
My Lords, the new lockdown rules are making the job of the police almost impossible. Not my words, but the words of John Apter, chairman of the Frontline Police Federation. On the next sunny weekend, a father of 5 in London can now gather his household and drive for a day's exercise to the Lake District. Could I ask the noble lady, were the police consulted on this relaxation of the rules? And could the noble lady, the leader, tell the House what advice she would give to the police who checked the vehicle at the entrance to Cumbria, particularly in the light of convoys of other drivers doing the same? And finally, does the noble lady think that this decision is an example of the use of good, solid British common sense?
Well, I'd first of all like to pay tribute to the police for the fantastic work that they've done. And I can assure the Noble Lord that the Home Office has been working very closely with the police to make sure that the new guidance is clear to officers. And indeed, the police are regularly updating their guidance, and those discussions will continue. The overwhelming majority of the public will follow the rules without the need for enforcement action or for the police to take action, and that is welcome. But the police must, of course, have the ability to act if people are acting recklessly, and they have been doing that around the country, and we commend them for the great work that they've done.
The Lord Cormac.
My Lords, could I ask my noble friend what plans there are to give museums and galleries the opportunity to reopen in July? These are much appreciated resources. They're also at the heart of our tourist industry, many of them. And whilst I completely accept that we could not just necessarily open the doors and let everybody come, presumably we could arrange systems of bookings so that numbers were controlled as well as distance maintained. Can my noble friend reflect on that and give me some encouragement?
Well, the Noble Lord, one of the great tragedies one of the many tragedies of the virus is the fact that we're not able to enjoy the fantastic cultural life, indeed the sporting events that we all may have been looking forward to in the summer. As he will know, museums, cinemas, theatres are being looked at in relation to step 3, so that would be July at the earliest. But again, I have to stress that all this is based on ensuring that we keep the disease under control. Of course, we've seen examples through supermarkets, through other businesses that have been able to remain open through this time, being able to find ways in which you can safely social distance. And I'm sure a lot of that learning, and indeed as we see other countries internationally come out of lockdowns, there will be a lot of best practice through which museums and other organisations like that can learn to ensure that if we get to a point, and let's hope we do, that they are able to open their doors, albeit perhaps to a smaller number of visitors, that they can do so in a safe way so that we can start to see a bit more of normal life return.
The Lord Monk.
Hello? Hello?
I can hear you.
Yes, I can. Lord Monk's on the line. Can you hear me?
Carry on.
It's your turn to ask your question now.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear
Please
you.
speak, Lord Monks.
Thank you. After a few days of muddle and mixed messages, it's very welcome that the government has acted positively on health and safety of workers. TUC's described it as a step in the right direction. The challenge now is to live up to the Prime Minister's promises. And as the Noble Lord Newby said, will this involve extra resources, if necessary, for the HSE, additional to the welcome 14 million we've had today? Will it involve much needed investment in PPE so that we don't
have to experience the same kind of problems they've had in care homes, spreading to other workplaces? And will there be legal protection for whistleblowers? Is the government likely to encourage the network of union safety reps to be mobilised? They can do an important job on this. And will the self-employed get the same protection as employees?
Well, I thank the Noble Lord for recognising and mentioning the comments of the TUC that these guidelines are a step in the right direction. And I think it is a testament to the fact, as I've already said, that the unions, businesses, health and safety executive and government have been working very closely, because this is of absolute paramount importance that we ensure workplaces are safe for all of those who are returning for work. As he rightly said, and I've mentioned, further funding has been provided to the HSE. I'm sure that that discussions will continue to make sure that everyone has the resources that they need in order that we can make sure that slowly but surely people are able to go back to their workplaces, that they're able to start that side of their life again, as I'm sure many people around the country want to do. And I'm sure there will be a positive partnership between employers and employees, as we all want the best for everyone and this country to come out of this terrible disease.
My Lords, I'd like to pursue a point raised by the Noble Baroness Lady Smith of Basildon. The Prime Minister's statement says that different parts of the UK may need to stay in full lockdown longer. But what evidence base will the government use, and will it publish the past, current and future R rates for all parts of the United Kingdom so that future decisions can be shared, discussed and understood?
Well, I hope I did answer that question by talking about the role of the Joint Biosecurity Centre, this new body that's been set up, will have a critical role going forward. One of their roles will be to identify specific local actions to address local spikes in infection in partnership with local agencies. It will work with the devolved administrations and SAGE to provide guidance, and we're continually looking. We want to be transparent at what data we can make available as our knowledge of this virus grows.
The Baroness Holland.
My Lords, in the new plan, how will the needs and best interests of individuals with protected characteristics, as required under the Equality and Mental Capacity Acts, be balanced with public health concerns? Just, for example, just as in society at large, could family contact be resumed for people in care when both parties have recovered from COVID-19, for example, or will blanket rules continue in care settings, regardless of the mental well-being and best interests of individuals? And I include here the 1 in 4 disabled adults of working age who also live in care homes.
Well, of course, we are absolutely cognizant to the very real and issues that many of the socially isolated are having, and we are very, very concerned about them. But what we also cannot do is put them, their carers, their families in danger and put them in a situation where the virus could start to get out of control once again. So we, of course, we keep this under review, but we are proceeding with cautious steps because we have seen a tragedy in care homes and we want to make sure that that does not happen again. We want to make sure that everyone is safe and that we can move forward as a country. But I can assure the Noble Baroness that we are very aware of all these issues and we take them into the round as we're making decisions as we start to move away from the lockdown.
The Baroness Neville Rolfe.
The Prime Minister is rightly charting a staged return to normality in the interests of our economy and our economic future. And I agree with my noble friend that we can learn from abroad. Can the government consider adopting the World Health Organization standards of 1 metre rather than 2 metres of social distancing, as Denmark has done as part of its recovery? It could help, for example, to restore the scale of activity we need in our vital construction sector, or indeed in galleries and museums mentioned by my noble friend, Lord Cormac.
Well, there is good reason for the 2-metre social distancing rules, because both experimental and mathematically modelled data does support the view that the droplets which are associated with the spread of coronavirus expelled during breathing and talking in the main drop to the ground within a 2-metre radius of the person. So there is science behind the 2-metre rule. Having said that, as we get the virus more under control, as we continue with our hand washing, with the social distancing, and hopefully we steadily move to have this disease even further under control, this is something that SAGE does continually look at, but there is good reason for the 2-metre rule at the moment.
Lord Mackenzie of Luton.
My Lords, I'd like to start with the context of this and the fact that we now know that it's the low-paid in manual jobs who face the greater risk of dying from the virus than the high-paid white-collar workers. Can I ask the Minister whether that's considered acceptable and what steps it's proposed to take to rectify it? Could I also join my noble friend Lord Monks in recommending that the government look to TU safety reps as a significant resource to help tackle the current situation. And finally, if I may, one of the sectors that the government is particularly focused on to make a start under the baby return, and that is construction. And of course, one of the things we know about construction that it is one of the riskier sectors so far as health and safety is concerned. There's a long history of challenges to the HSE. And although there have been certainly improvements made in recent times, it's an added challenge to the HSE to go about the task that it has been set. Is the government satisfied with that?
Well, on the Noble Lord's first point, we are extremely concerned about the apparent disparities in how COVID-19 is affecting people, which is why Public Health England are undertaking a rapid review to provide insight into how different factors such as ethnicity, deprivation, age, gender and obesity are disproportionately impacting people. The review is underway now and the findings will be published at the end of the month. In relation to his other points, as I said, we are working very closely with the unions and businesses in terms of developing our guidance, and I'm sure that we will take advantage of the excellent union reps that the two Noble Lords have mentioned. And as I say, we are working closely with business in all sectors, including construction, to make sure that the workforce who return go to a safe place. It is in all our interests, and I believe that both employers and employees will work together to ensure that that happens.
Lord Fox.
My Lords, the Prime Minister's statement announced an escalation in the increase of fines. The preceding debate this afternoon highlighted how much there is much confusion around legally enforceable regulations and not enforceable guidelines. And the Lord Mackenzie highlighted the difficulty that police have. So in the order to develop some clarity, perhaps the Minister could give us just two specific examples of public behaviour that the new increased fines are designed to stop.
Well, as I said, the Home Office is working closely with the police on the guidance, and I'm sure they will be updating it through the NPPCC and the College of Policing. As the Noble Lord rightly says, fines will go up to £100, but shall be lowered to £50 if paid within 14 days. And as now, for members of the public who do not follow the rules, the police can arrest individuals acting unlawfully, instruct people to go home, leave an area, or disperse or impose fines. But I do think it's worth reiterating to Noble Lords that the vast majority of people are respecting the rules. They are respecting what is happening. This is for a very small minority who are not. And it is absolutely right that the police have tools at their disposal in order to deal with that minority.
The Baroness Hayman.
My Lords, I draw attention to my interest in the register. Yesterday, answering questions on the statement, the Prime Minister spoke of the huge opportunities for cleaner, greener transport in the government's current proposals. Does the noble lady, the Leader of the House, agree with me that looking ahead to the enormous investment that will be required to rebuild our shattered economy, we need not to try and replicate exactly what we had before, but to take the opportunities to build back better and forge a greener, fairer, and more sustainable economy for the future?
Yes, I do agree. And that is why, for instance, we've announced a £2 billion package to boost cycling and walking, including £250 million for an emergency travel fund for England to create pop-up cycle lanes and cycle-only corridors. This is a personal priority for the Prime Minister, and I can assure the noble lady that is one of the top things on the agenda of the Secretary of State for Transport.
The Lord Sheikh.
My lords, I know 3 persons who did contract COVID-19, one of whom was very seriously ill. Fortunately, they're all well again, thanks to our marvelous NHS. Unfortunately, it has come to light that members of the BAME communities are more likely to contract COVID-19 with fatal consequences compared to the rest of the population. My lords, I understand that a letter has been sent to the Prime Minister, signed by 70 dignitaries, asking for an independent inquiry to look into the reason why this is happening. Can I ask my noble friend, the Leader of the House, if an independent inquiry will take place? If so, what is the timetable for this to happen?
Well, I'm very sorry to hear about the friends of the noble lord, and I'm glad to hear that they and I too pay tribute to the fantastic work of all of those in our NHS and care homes who are keeping us so safe. As I mentioned in a previous answer, Public Health England are undertaking a rapid review of how different factors, including ethnicity, are disproportionately impacting people. The review is being led by Professor Kevin Fenton, the London Regional Director of Public Health at Public Health England, and the findings will be published at the end of the month.
Baroness Blackstone.
My Lords, the Secretary of State for Education has said that nothing can replace being in the classroom. So can the Leader of the House confirm that all primary school pupils will be able to return to school by the end of June, and that further reassurances will be given to parents about this? If the R rate allows, will the government also reconsider its plans for secondary schools so that all these pupils, whose mental well-being is also at stake, can return to school, even if only briefly, before the summer holidays, which will help to mitigate the growing inequality amongst children in this age group?
Well, I'm afraid, as with everything, I cannot make categorical promises or guarantees. Everything is being done in a cautious way. Everything is being done on the basis of the science, the data and public health. But what I can certainly say to the noble Baroness is it is our ambition for all primary school children to be able to return before the summer for a month, if feasible, but this will be kept under review. At this point, I'm afraid only secondary school pupils with exams next year. We're also hoping that they will be able to have some face-to-face contact with teachers to support their remote learning. But at this point, there are no plans for other secondary school pupils to return to school before the summer.
The Baroness Bennett of Manor Castle.
My Lords, this statement launched the government's document, Our Plan to Rebuild. I quote from that. It says, anyone with symptoms should isolate immediately along with their households and apply for a test. If a negative test is returned, then isolation is no longer required, end quote. But the NHS is widely reported as estimating a false negative rate of 30% for swab tests. Pulse Today reported on the 1st of May that the advice from NHS England is for GPs and other staff who've tested negative not to return to work if they still have symptoms. Can the noble lady, the Minister, explain to me the dangerous, potentially deadly, apparent gap between those two sets of advice?
Well, if people have symptoms, they should, of course, self-isolate along with their households. And as we've said all along, it's extremely important that people look after themselves, that they follow the advice, and that they self-isolate if they think they have any symptoms. We are moving forward from the lockdown in an extremely cautious manner, and it's absolutely imperative that everybody puts their health first and the health of everyone around them.
Lord Lansley.
My Lords, there is limited evidence about the extent of transmission of the virus between children and between children and adults. So returning to the issue of schools, I wonder if my noble friend would see if the government would publish its evidence about transmission of the virus between children, but also look to France, who today are allowing the youngest young people to back into school in a way similar to that proposed for this country at the beginning of June, and perhaps try to acquire data which would give reassurance, not least to teachers, about the safety of young people returning to school.
Well, we certainly will be looking at international evidence, and as countries come out of their lockdowns at different rates and with different taking different measures, of course, I think internationally we will all learn from that. I can assure my noble friend that the Government for Science is working to regularly publish evidence documents and studies which have formed the basis of SAGE's discussions and advice to ministers, and we certainly do expect that to include the reopening of schools and the data that he raises.
Baroness Andrews.
My Lords, further to the question that was asked of the Leader of the House by my noble friend, the Leader of the Opposition, can the Leader confirm now that the Prime Minister did not actually consult the devolved nations about his change of message from stay at home to stay alert and the policy that follows? And therefore, will she now explain why the Prime Minister thinks that it's safe for people to go back to work in England, while in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, this is seen as too risky and premature?
Well, the Prime Minister has regular conversations with the devolved administrations, the leaders of those administrations, and as I said, they are involved in all the COBRA meetings and discussions, so there is close dialogue. As Nicola Sturgeon said, perhaps reflecting the fact that our first cases came slightly later than in England, so we might be at a different and slightly later stage of the infection. As we move out of lockdown, while we want to move as the four nations together, if there are slight differences, then we will need to take that into account. But I don't think the divergence and the approach between the four nations is as much as has been made, and we continue to work closely together because we all want the best for all of our citizens.
My Lords, the time allocated for a statement is now up. The day's virtual proceedings are now complete and are adjourned.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.